What if I told you that the greatest symbol of freedom in the Western world was born not from a dream of justice, but from a nightmare of tyranny? History remembers Magna Carta as a beacon of democracy, a holy text of rights and liberty. But look closer at the ink. Is it possible that this revered document was actually a desperate failure? Why would a king agree to limit his own power only to beg the Pope to destroy the agreement just 10 weeks later? And how did a peace treaty meant to stop a war actually ignite one of the most brutal conflicts England has ever seen? To find the answer, we cannot look at the parchment alone. We must look at the man who was forced to seal it. Who was King John? Was he truly the cartoon villain of the Robin Hood legends, a phony king sucking the wealth from his people? Or was he a brilliant tortured administrator trapped in the shadow of his superstar brother, Richard the Lionheart? Did he really murder his own nephew in a drunken rage? And how did a man who lost his empire, his treasury, and his dignity in the mud of the wash end up accidentally saving the future of the law? Tonight, we are not just reading a legal text. We are stepping into a world of burning castles, starving garrisons, and whispered conspiracies. We are going to unravel the mystery of how a disastrous reign and a broken promise created the world we live in today. How does a monster create a miracle? Close your eyes. Let's drift back to the year 1215, where the air smells of danger and the ink is just beginning to dry. The story of King John and Magna Carta is one of the most significant turning points in medieval English history, not because it was born from idealism or democratic vision, but because it emerged from a long chain of failures, pressures, and the slow, steady evolution of English law. To understand why Magna Carta appeared in 1215, one must step back to the reigns of John's father, Henry II, and his older brother, Richard the Lionheart, for the roots of the crisis stretch across decades of taxation, warfare, and royal overreach. Henry II, who ruled from 1154 to 1106, created one of the most sophisticated legal systems in medieval Europe. His reforms, known collectively as common law, introduced the concept that royal justice should follow predictable procedures, the use of itinerant justices, trial by jury of local knights, and royal writs helped create a legal culture in which fairness, precedent, and accountability slowly grew. Yet this system also gave the Crown more financial leverage because every legal action brought fees, fines, and opportunities for revenue. Henry II was powerful, but he was also feared. His sons inherited a kingdom where the machinery of law was both respected and resented. Richard I, now known as Richard the Lionheart, ascended the throne in 1189. But Richard was a king in name far more than presence. During his 10-year reign, he spent only months in England. Most of his rule was consumed by the Third Crusade, by battles in France, and by his costly ransom after being captured on his return from the Holy Land. Because Richard was absent, the English government relied heavily on officials, justices, and tax collectors. Common law continued operating like a millstone that never stopped turning, as chroniclers noted, but the burden of financing Richard's wars and ransom fell directly on the barons, clergy, and common people. The taxes were enormous, but at least Richard was admired as a warrior king. Even so, the seeds of resentment had quietly taken root. When Richard died in 1199, his younger brother John inherited the throne. John lacked his brother's charisma, leadership, and military skill. Almost immediately, he faced a crisis. Through a combination of poor decisions, weak alliances, and diplomatic mismanagement, he lost Normandy and nearly all the English lands in France to King Philip II of France by 1204. This was not just a territorial loss, it was a psychological shock. The great Angevin Empire created by Henry II collapsed in John's hands. Many English barons still owned estates both in England and France. Losing Normandy disrupted their marriages, property, and political power. They blamed John, and their trust began to fracture. In response to these losses, John desperately sought revenue. He turned to the legal system not as a tool of justice, but as a weapon. Chroniclers said he used the law as a whip. Fines grew heavier. Feudal incidents, traditional payments owed to the crown, were pushed to extremes. John punished enemies ruthlessly and rewarded allies arbitrarily. The tradition that the king must at least honour certain feudal customs was repeatedly ignored. Above all, John's habit of breaking promises became infamous. One chronicler wrote, "His every oath was broken by the next dawn." The turning point came when John attempted to reassert his authority in France and suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. This final failure exhausted the patience of the barons. They gathered in rebellion, declaring that John had violated the ancient customs of the realm and must agree to new limits on royal power. Their demands reflected not a revolutionary spirit, but a restoration of norms that had slowly developed under Henry II's legal reforms. This pressure culminated at Runnymede in June 1215. Forced into negotiation, John affixed his seal to a document that would later be called Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It was not meant to be a radical constitution. It was a peace treaty, a list of restraints demanded by angry barons who no longer trusted their king. And yet, many of its principles would echo through the centuries. Among its most important clauses were those stating that a free man could not be punished except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. These terms, judgment of his equals and law of the land, carried enormous weight. They drew directly from the common law traditions Henry II had cultivated, emphasizing that justice must follow known procedures and that the king himself must obey those procedures. The idea that authority must act according to law and not personal whim was a profound statement, even if it emerged from necessity rather than idealism. However, Magna Carta did not immediately transform England. Within weeks, John attempted to annul it with the help of the Pope, declaring it void. Civil war erupted, the First Barons' War, but John's sudden death in 1216 changed everything. His son, Henry III, was only 9 years old. The regents who ruled in his name understood that peace required compromise. They reissued Magna Carta, removing some of the most confrontational clauses, and presented it as a mutual agreement rather than a surrender forced upon the crown. Over the following decades, Magna Carta was reissued several times. It moved from being a crisis document into a symbol of lawful governance. Copies were stored in churches, referenced by judges, and invoked by political leaders. While many of its clauses concerned specific feudal matters no longer relevant today, the principles it articulated, government accountability, legal procedure, and the idea that rulers must obey the law, became foundational to English political development. By the time of Henry III's long reign, Magna Carta had shifted from a desperate demand into a constitutional tradition. Its authority grew not because kings embraced it, but because generations of lawyers, barons, and common people repeated it, defended it, and insisted that the crown honour it. In this sense, Magna Carta became larger than John, larger than Henry III, and larger than the crisis that created it. Although born from conflict, frustration, and the failures of a flawed king, Magna Carta endures because it represents something universal, the belief that power must have limits and that justice must have rules. Its legacy would inspire the development of Parliament, the English Civil War, the American Constitution, and countless movements for rights and liberty. What began as a practical peace treaty in 1215 became one of the world's most influential legal documents, not because it was perfect, but because it dared to claim that even a king must follow the law. Close your eyes now and let the heavy velvet curtain of the present fall away, leaving us in the hushed, flickering twilight of the 12th century. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We drift backward, past the smokestacks of the industrial age, past the powdered wigs of the Georgians, until we arrive in a time of stone and iron where the air smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and the metallic tang of polished armour. It is 1154 and the crown rests on the head of Henry II, a man whose energy burns so brightly it threatens to scorch the very parchment of history. He is the first of the Plantagenets, a dynasty that historians still argue was either the greatest blessing or the most volatile curse to ever befall the English throne. There is a legend, whispered by servants in the drafty corridors of the royal palaces, that this family is descended from Melusine, a water demon who flew out of a church window rather than witness the elevation of the host. From the devil we came, and to the devil we shall return, Richard the Lionheart famously joked, though perhaps with a nervous glance over his shoulder. But here, in the early years of this sprawling empire, the devil is in the details, specifically the details of administration. Henry II is a whirlwind in a tunic, a king who refuses to sit still. Literally, his courtiers complain that their feet ache because the king stands from dawn till dusk, dictating letters, judging disputes, and planning the architecture of a new world. He is building something invisible but stronger than any castle wall, the common law. Can you hear the scratching of the quills? It is the sound of 1,000 monks and clerks in the chancery, writing the writs that will one day bind his son John in a web of his own family's making. Henry envisions a land where justice is not just a duel between angry neighbours in a muddy field, but a system of juries and evidence, a reliable machine that hums with the authority of the crown. It is noble work, yet it is expensive work. Every writ costs a silver penny. Every judgment brings a fine. The devil's brood, as his children are called, watch this machine grow. They see the power of the pen and the sword, and amongst them, watching with sharp, covetous eyes, is the youngest, John. He is just a boy now, unaware that the vast empire his father rides across, from the heather of Scotland to the sun-baked Pyrenees, will one day feel like sand slipping through his fingers. The seeds of the Great Charter are not sown on a battlefield, but here, in the quiet, dusty rooms, where the king's law begins to take shape, promising justice while quietly demanding gold, a paradox that will one day awaken the sleeping giant of English liberty. The year is 1189, and the old king, Henry, has breathed his last, leaving the heavy golden circlet of the English crown to his eldest surviving son, Richard. If Henry was the architect who built the house of Plantagenet with stone and law, Richard is the knight who hangs his banner from the highest turret and then immediately rides away to find adventure. History remembers him as the Lionheart, a name that echoes with the clash of steel and the roar of the crowds, but for the people of England, he is less of a king and more of a magnificent, expensive ghost. Close your eyes and imagine the atmosphere shifting. The frantic scratching of Henry's clerks is replaced by the thunder of hooves and the ringing of blacksmith hammers. Richard does not love the damp green quiet of England. He loves the sun-baked plains of the Holy Land and the chivalric romance of the Crusade. To him, England is not a home, but a bank vault, a storehouse of silver to be unlocked to fund his holy wars. He spends barely 6 months of his 10-year reign on English soil, a fact that historians still argue over with polite ferocity. Was he a negligent landlord who abandoned his people, or the ultimate medieval superstar whose distant glory gave England a place on the world stage? Regardless of the verdict, the cost of his glory is immediate and staggering. Can you feel the weight of the coin in your palm? Richard begins his reign by putting everything up for sale. Sheriffdoms, earldoms, castles and liberties are auctioned off to the highest bidder. With a charming, dangerous smile, he famously jokes that he would sell London itself if only he could find a buyer rich enough to take it. It is a light-hearted comment that sends a shiver of cold reality down the spines of his advisers. The sheer scale of the preparation for the Third Crusade sucks the moisture right out of the English economy, leaving it dry and brittle. Yet, here is the irony, gentle listener. The legal machine his father built is so perfect, so ruthlessly efficient, that it runs without him. It turns and grinds like a great water wheel in a river, collecting taxes, judging pleas, and managing the harvest, even while the miller is thousands of miles away fighting Saladin. This is the era of the administrators, men like Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who governs England with a steady, unsmiling competence. He is the unsung hero of this quiet chapter, the man who ensures the realm does not collapse while the king plays at war. Imagine the great hall of Westminster, not filled with feasting, but with the hushed murmur of the exchequer. A large table is covered with a checkered cloth, the original exchequer, where officials move piles of silver counters like chess pieces, tallying the debts owed to the absent king. Click, click, click go the counters. It is a soothing, rhythmic sound, but it represents a tightening noose. The barons watch this machine with a mixture of awe and growing resentment. They are paying for a king they never see. They are taxed on their land, their movable goods, and their harvest. The Saladin tithe is levied, a tax so heavy it feels like a punishment for staying home. But Richard is the Lionheart. He is the hero of Christendom, and so they pay. They pay for the ships, they pay for the armour, and they pay for the horses. And then disaster strikes, not in battle, but in transit. On his return journey from the Holy Land, Richard is captured by the Duke of Austria and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. The hero is in chains. The news travels slowly, carried by exhausted messengers across the Alps and the Channel, arriving in England like a damp fog. The ransom demanded is astronomical, 150,000 marks. To put that in perspective, it is roughly 2 to 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown. It is a sum that should be impossible. And yet, the machine turns. The administrators do not panic. They simply reach deeper into the pockets of the realm. The wool is taxed, the very fleece off the sheep's back, smelling of lanolin and rain. The church silver is melted down, the chalices and crucifixes turning into ingots to buy back the king. Everyone pays. It is said that there was not a single man in England who did not feel the pinch of Richard's captivity. But amidst this national draining of wealth, there is another figure lurking in the shadows, watching the money flow out and the resentment flow in. It is John. While Richard has been away seeking glory, John has been in England testing the boundaries, stirring trouble, and learning a very dangerous lesson. He sees that the crown can demand almost anything, and the people will obey, provided the machinery of law is used to enforce it. He watches the sheer power of the administrative state his father created, and he sees not a tool for justice, but a tool for control. John is 32 years old when Richard finally dies in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France. A messy, unglamorous end for a golden legend. The Lionheart is gone. The noise of the Crusades fades into silence. The heavy indebted crown is lifted from the coffin and placed upon John's head, but the treasury is empty. The goodwill of the barons is frayed thin, like an old tapestry left too long in the sun. The millstone of government is still turning, grinding away, but now it has a new master, a man who lacks the charm to make the grinding bearable. The transition is subtle, like the light changing from the golden hour of afternoon to the grey uncertainty of dusk. John inherits the debts, the exhausted lands, and the powerful, resentful barons who have learned that a king can be absent and the law will still stand. He inherits a kingdom that is tired. You can almost hear the collective sigh of the English countryside, the creak of the empty wagons, the rustle of the empty ledgers. The stage is set for a different kind of conflict, not against a foreign sultan, but against the very limits of royal power. The Lionheart's expensive glory has been purchased, but the bill has come due, and it is John who holds the receipt. As we leave the era of the absent hero, we step into the shadow of the present anti-hero, and the air grows cooler, closer, and filled with the static of coming storms. The crown settles onto John's brow in the spring of 1199, but it fits differently than it did on his brothers. If Richard wore power like a glittering cloak of chainmail, John wears it like a scratchy wool tunic, uncomfortable, slightly too tight, and constantly reminding him of his own physical limitations. He is 32 years old, a man fully grown, yet, in the eyes of history and his contemporaries, he is eternally the little brother, the afterthought, the one left standing when the giants have fallen. To understand the bitterness that seeps into the soil of his reign like groundwater, we must look at the name his father gave him when he was just a child, a nickname that stuck like a burr to a hem. Jean Sans-Terre. John Lackland. It was a joke, a bit of rough, fatherly humour from Henry II, pointing out that by the time John was born, the vast family estate had already been carved up for his older brothers. There was no land left for the baby. Imagine growing up with a name that defines you by what you do not have. It plants a seed of insecurity that grows into a mighty oak of grasping need. John spends his life trying to prove he is not Lackland, trying to hold onto territory with a desperation that eventually makes him lose it all. He is a man of striking contradictions, a figure who steps out of the tapestries not as a cardboard villain twirling a moustache, but as a deeply human, deeply flawed bundle of nerves. Physically, he is nothing like the towering, golden-haired Lionheart. John is shorter, stockier, darker. He does not stride, he paces. He is possessed of a manic, restless energy. While Richard would sleep in a tent and dream of Jerusalem, John prefers the comforts of a warm hearth and a soft bed. Surprisingly, and this brings a rare, gentle smile to the face of the modern historian, John is obsessed with cleanliness. In an era where a monthly bath was considered a sign of extreme piety or extreme vanity, John bathes constantly. He travels with his own bathtub, a wooden tub lined with linen, dragging it across the muddy roads of England so he can soak away the grime of the road. It is a small humanizing detail, a king who just wants to be clean in a dirty world. But inside, his mind is a clutter of suspicion. He is intelligent, perhaps the most intelligent of all his family. He is literate, he collects books, and he has a sharp, legalistic mind that delights in the fine print. When he sits in judgment, he doesn't just nod and wave his hand. He leans in, asks questions, and obsesses over the details of the law. He wants to know why. But this intelligence is curdled by paranoia. He trusts no one. He sees treachery in a whisper and betrayal in a glance. And to be fair to John, he is not entirely wrong. The court he inherits is a viper's nest. The barons, exhausted by Richard's taxes, look at this new, shorter king and wonder if they can push him around. They test the fences. They hold back their dues. They murmur about his nephew, Arthur. Here lies the great shadow over John's early reign, the question of succession. Strictly speaking, by the rules of primogeniture that were slowly solidifying in Europe, The crown should arguably have gone to Arthur of Brittany, the son of John's deceased older brother, Geoffrey. Arthur is a boy, a teenager, but he represents a direct line. John is the uncle, the usurper in the eyes of some. This rivalry gnaws at John. It makes him look over his shoulder. It makes every dinner invite a calculation of loyalty. He knows that as long as Arthur lives and breathes across the Channel, his own claim to the throne is fragile. This insecurity drives him to be controlling. Unlike Richard, who let the administrators run the show, John wants to do everything himself. He micromanages the kingdom. He travels frantically from castle to castle, checking the ledgers, counting the silverware, ensuring that the sheriffs aren't skimming off the top. It is a style of kingship that is intense and personal. He is governing by eyebrow, watching everyone close up. For the common people, this can actually be a good thing. John is often seen as more accessible than his brother. You could actually find the king and petition him. But for the barons, who are used to being left alone to run their vast estates like mini-kingdoms, John's interference is suffocating. He is the landlord who uses his own key to enter your house and check if you've dusted the mantle. He breathes down their necks. And because the treasury is so empty, drained by the crusades and the ransom, John uses his knowledge of the law to squeeze them. He revives old fines. He charges exorbitant fees for inheriting land or marrying off a daughter. He turns the feudal system into a cash register, ringing up every technicality. Historians still argue fiercely about the nature of John's personality. Was he, as the Victorian chroniclers painted him, a monstrous aberration, a man of pure evil, or was he simply a competent administrator trapped in an impossible situation, a victim of bad timing and worse press? The truth, as we drift through the grey areas of history, likely lies in the middle. He was a capable man with a fatal flaw. He could not inspire love. He could buy loyalty. He could force submission. But he could not make men want to die for him. In the medieval world, where personal charisma was the glue of politics, this was a catastrophic deficiency. He was prone to mollesse, a medieval term for a kind of slacking inactivity, followed by bursts of furious erratic action. He would idle for months, tasting wines and buying jewels, and then suddenly march an army across the country in a fit of rage. As the 12th century bleeds into the 13th, the atmosphere in the court changes. The open air of the crusade is replaced by the claustrophobia of the council chamber. The maps are unrolled on the heavy oak tables, the corners weighed down by candlesticks. The Angevin Empire, that vast collection of lands stretching from the rainy Scottish border to the olive groves of the south of France, is trembling. It is too big, too disparate, held together only by the terrifying energy of Henry II and the reputation of Richard. John has neither. He has only his wits, his bathtub, and his growing list of enemies. He is the youngest son, the one who wasn't supposed to be here, standing in the centre of a room that is slowly shrinking. Outside the castle walls, the seasons turn. The peasants plant their rye and barley, the sheep are shorn, and the church bells ring the hours, marking the passage of time in a world that feels durable and slow. But inside the royal apartments, time is racing. John knows he is being tested. He knows the King of France, Philip Augustus, a man as cunning as a fox and as patient as a stone, is watching him, waiting for a mistake. And John, with his nervous energy and his chip on the shoulder, is prone to mistakes. The tragedy of John is not that he didn't try. It is that he tried too hard, in the wrong ways, at the wrong times. He tightened his grip until the sand turned to glass, and then shattered. As night falls on the early years of his reign, we leave John pacing by the fire, the shadows dancing on the stone walls, reflecting the turmoil in his mind. He has the crown, but he does not yet have the security. And somewhere in the darkness of Brittany, young Arthur is growing up, a living, breathing alternative to the king. The stage is set for a choice that will stain John's soul and define his legacy forever. The bitterness of his inheritance is about to turn into the poison of his reign. The River Seine flows through the heart of Normandy like a dark, glossy ribbon, ancient and indifferent to the kings who claim its banks. It is April in the year 1203, and the air in Rouen hangs heavy with the scent of unwashed stone, river mud, and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. We are standing on the precipice of the event that will stain King John's soul forever, a moment wrapped in shadow and silence that historians have spent 8 centuries trying to illuminate. This is the story of the dark waters and the disappearance of Arthur of Brittany. To understand the tragedy of this night, we must rewind the tape of history just a little to a rare moment of brilliance in John's chaotic life. Months earlier, his mother, the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 80s and still the toughest player on the board, was trapped in the castle of Mirebeau. The besieging army was led by none other than Arthur, John's teenage nephew and rival for the throne. In a flash of decisive energy that surprised everyone, including himself, John marched his army 40 miles in 48 hours. He struck at dawn, shattering the siege, rescuing his mother, and capturing Arthur alive. It was a triumph. It was the kind of victory Richard would have won. For a brief, shining moment, John held all the cards. He had his rival in chains, his mother safe, and his reputation soaring. But victory, for John, is often just the prelude to a new kind of failure. He has the prize, but he does not know what to do with it. Arthur is 16 years old enough to be a king, young enough to be a tragic figure. He is arrogant, defiant, and refuses to renounce his claim to the English throne. John moves him from castle to castle, a high-value pawn in a game that is rapidly losing its rules. Finally, Arthur is brought to the gloomy fortress at Rouen, the capital of the Norman dukes. The tower overlooking the river is damp and cold, the kind of place where hope goes to catch a chill and die. Now, close your eyes and listen to the sounds of Easter weekend, 1203. The church bells have stopped ringing for the night. The castle is quiet, save for the footsteps of the guard and the crackle of the hearth. Inside the royal apartments, John is drinking. The chroniclers tell us he was fond of wine, perhaps too fond when the pressures of the crown became a vice around his temples. He is brooding. As long as Arthur lives, the threat remains. As long as Arthur breathes, the barons in Brittany and France have a figurehead for their rebellion. The logic of power is cold and binary. 2 kings cannot occupy the same space. What happens next is obscured by the fog of history, a deliberate silence created by the perpetrators. There is no official record, no royal writ announcing the death. There are only whispers that turn into legends. The most detailed account comes from the Margam Annals, written by a monk in Wales who claimed to have inside information. He writes that on the Thursday before Easter, after dinner, when he was drunk and possessed by the devil, John killed Arthur with his own hand. It is a chilling image. The King of England, the son of the lawmaker Henry II, descending into the dungeon, or perhaps taking the boy out onto the river in a skiff and ending the rivalry with a sword or a heavy stone. Other historians argue for a less personal, though no less brutal, end. They suggest Arthur was simply quietly removed by jailers, or that he tried to escape and fell from the high walls into the rushing Seine, his heavy cloak pulling him down into the black water. But the method matters less than the result. One day, Arthur is there, a prisoner in the tower. The next he is gone. No body is ever found. No funeral is ever held. He simply evaporates into the mist of the river. The psychological impact of this event on John cannot be overstated. Up until this point, he was a politician, a manoeuvrer, a man playing the game of feudal chess, but kinslaying, killing one's own flesh and blood, is a taboo that transcends politics. It is a primal sin. If Richard was the Lionheart, John has now become something darker, something wolf-like. You can imagine him standing at the window of the castle in Rouen, looking down at the water swirling past the stone foundations. Does he feel relief? Or does he feel the cold weight of the ghost that will now haunt him for the rest of his life? The silence of the river offers no comfort. The disappearance of Arthur is a stone dropped into a calm pond. The ripples are slow at first, but they will eventually become a tidal wave that swamps the empire. Rumours begin to leak out of Rouen like water through a cracked hull. The Bretons, Arthur's people, refuse to believe he is dead at first. They wait for him. They pray for him. But as the months drag on and the boy does not appear, their hope turns to a cold, hard rage. They do not need a body to know that a crime has been committed. The French king, Philip Augustus, seizes upon the rumour with the glee of a master strategist. He now has the ultimate propaganda weapon. John is not just a weak king, he is a monster. He is a murderer of nephews. This is the moment the moral authority of the Plantagenet crown cracks. The barons, those rough men of iron and earth, can tolerate a greedy king. They can tolerate a lecherous king. They can even tolerate a cruel king, provided his cruelty is directed at enemies of the realm. But a king who kills his own family in the dark, that is an instability that threatens everyone. If the king's own nephew is not safe by the laws of God and man, then who is? A chill wind blows through the manors of England. The trust, already thin, dissolves completely. And yet life in the castle goes on. This is the surreal nature of history. The servants still light the fires, the cooks still roast the capons, the musicians still play their lutes in the corner, trying to drown out the heavy silence that hangs over the king's table. John continues to sign charters, to issue writs, to order new robes of silk and samite. He tries to act as if the world has not shifted on its axis. He moves with a frantic energy, perhaps trying to outrun the memory of that night in the boat. He becomes even more obsessed with loyalty, demanding hostages from his barons, sons and daughters, held as insurance policies against betrayal. He knows what he is capable of, and so he assumes everyone else is capable of the same treachery. The waters of the Seine keep flowing, carrying their secrets out to the English Channel. The ghost of Arthur becomes more powerful than the living boy ever was. He becomes a martyr, a symbol of John's tyranny. In the end, the physical act of the murder, whether it was a drunken rage or a cold calculation, is less important than the shadow it casts. It is the shadow of illegitimacy. John has bought his security with blood, but the price is his soul and the loyalty of his subjects. As we leave the damp stones of Rouen, the sun is setting on the Angevin Empire, though John refuses to see it. The darkness of the river seems to seep into the map itself. The lands of Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou, the ancestral home of his family, are beginning to tremble. The murder of Arthur was meant to secure the borders, but instead it has unlocked the gates. The wolves are gathering, and they can smell the blood on the king's hands. The lullaby of the river has become a dirge. Close your eyes and you can almost hear the soft lapping of the water against the stone, washing away the evidence, but never, ever washing away the stain. The map of the medieval world is not drawn in ink, but in the fragile trust between a king and his lords, and in the year 1204, that map begins to curl and burn at the edges. We now witness the great unravelling, the collapse of the Angevin Empire, a structure that once seemed as permanent as the stars, but proves to be as ephemeral as morning mist. It begins with a castle, the magnificent Chateau Gaillard perched high on a limestone cliff overlooking the Seine, This was Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece, his saucy castle, built in a frenzy of stone and sweat to lock the door to Normandy against the French. Richard famously claimed he could hold it, even if its walls were made of butter. But Richard is dead, and the walls are made of stone, and the man coming to knock them down is Philip Augustus, the French king who possesses the patience of a glacier and the crushing weight of one too. Philip does not rush. He surrounds the castle, cutting off the supplies, and waits for hunger to do the work of swords. Inside the walls, the garrison looks west towards England, waiting for John to come. They watch the horizon until their eyes ache, but John does not come. This is the phase of John's reign that historians find most baffling, a period of strange paralysed lethargy. While the jewel of his empire is being strangled, John is in England, moving from manor to manor, eating well, and seemingly ignoring the catastrophe unfolding across the Channel. He famously boasts, "Let him swallow, and I will regurgitate," claiming that whatever Philip takes, he will win back in a single day. It is the bravado of a man who is terrified to act. Perhaps he is paralysed by the ghost of Arthur. Perhaps he knows his treasury is too empty to fund a massive relief force. Whatever the reason, the saucy castle is left to die. The siege is a grim affair, filled with the tragic suffering of civilians caught between the lines, but eventually, in March 1204, the French find a weakness, not a gate, but a garderobe chute, a latrine drain. In a detail that history insists on remembering with a wry grimace, the mighty fortress falls because the enemy crawls up the toilet. It is an undignified end to a glorious dream. With the fall of Chateau Gaillard, the dominoes begin to tumble with terrifying speed. Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the English kings, the land of William the Conqueror, surrenders. Rouen opens its gates, then Anjou, then Poitou. In the span of a single disastrous summer, the vast empire that Henry II spent a lifetime cobbling together dissolves. John has lost the land that gave his family their name. He is now truly Lackland, in a way his father never intended. The psychological shock of this loss is profound. For 150 years, the English aristocracy has been Anglo-Norman. They spoke French, they drank French wine, they held estates on both sides of the Channel. A baron might spend his summer hunting in Oxfordshire and his autumn harvesting grapes in Normandy. The Channel was not a border, it was a highway. But suddenly, Philip Augustus slams the door shut. He issues a decree: no man can serve two masters. The barons must choose. They must either pay homage to Philip and become French, or stay loyal to John and lose their ancestral lands on the continent. Imagine the bitterness of that choice. These men are forced to abandon castles where their grandfathers were born, vineyards that have been in their families for generations. They stream back to England, angry, dispossessed, and looking for someone to blame. And there, sitting on the throne of a rainy island that suddenly feels very small, is John. The loss of Normandy forces the English barons to become, for the first time, truly English. They are trapped on the island with their king. There is nowhere else to go. No other estates to distract them. The pressure cooker is sealed. This is a crucial, often overlooked ingredient in the recipe for Magna Carta. If John had been a successful general, if he had kept Normandy, the barons would have been too busy managing their cross-channel estates to gather in a meadow at Runnymede. But defeat concentrates the mind. It forces everyone to look inward. Historians still argue whether the loss of Normandy was inevitable. Some say the Angevin Empire was simply too big, a sprawling, unguarded patchwork that no single king could hold together against a focused, centralised power like France. They argue that John was merely the man holding the bag when the string finally snapped. Others are less forgiving, pointing to John's tactical blunders and his alienation of key allies as the spark that burned the house down. But for the people living through it, the why matters less than the what. The reality is a sense of claustrophobia. The king is now always here. He is not riding off to the Pyrenees. He is riding through Yorkshire, through the Midlands, constantly visible, constantly demanding to win back what he has lost. John needs money, immense amounts of it. A war of reconquest is the most expensive thing a medieval king can dream of. And so, the machinery of government, that great millstone we spoke of, begins to spin faster and faster. John turns his gaze to the wealth of his subjects with a predatory focus. The loss of foreign revenue means the tax burden on England doubles, then triples. The atmosphere in the court becomes brittle. You can imagine the tension in the heavy tapestries, the way the courtiers lower their voices when the king enters the room. He is a wounded animal now, humiliated on the world stage, desperate to prove his strength. And a weak king, trying to look strong, is the most dangerous ruler of all. Sensory details of this period are painted in shades of grey and mud. The vibrant, sun-drenched heraldry of the Angevin south is gone, replaced by the fog of the English shires. The ships that used to carry wine now sit idle in the ports or are commandeered for failed expeditions. The French language, once the natural tongue of the court, begins to sound slightly different. It is becoming a marker of an elite that is losing its connection to the mainland. The English identity is being forged in the fires of defeat. In the monasteries, the chroniclers sharpen their quills. They write of the soft sword, another cruel nickname for John, mocking his military failures. But John is not soft. He is brittle. He is a glass hammer, hard but liable to shatter. As the year 1204 fades into history, the English Channel transforms from a bridge into a moat. England stands alone, isolated from the continent in a way it hasn't been since 1066. The barons retire to their draughty English castles, counting their losses and nursing their grudges. They look at the king and see a man who has cost them their heritage. They begin to ask dangerous questions. If the king cannot protect our lands, why do we owe him our service? If he cannot maintain the feudal contract, why should we? The seeds of rebellion are watered by the rain of defeat. We leave this section with the image of King John standing on the white cliffs of Dover, staring out at the grey horizon, plotting a return that will take years to organise and will ultimately lead to his ruin. The empire is gone, but the bill for it is just arriving. The king turns his back on the sea and looks inland towards his subjects, his eyes narrowing. He will have his gold and he will have his revenge, even if he has to wring it out of every hide in England. The year is 1205, and a heavy silence is about to descend upon the green fields and stone villages of England, a silence so profound that it will be felt in the very marrow of the people's bones. It begins with the death. Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that towering administrator who had kept the machinery of government humming through the reigns of Richard and the early years of John, finally closes his eyes forever. Upon hearing the news, King John reportedly exclaimed with a joyous, unthinking relief, now for the first time, "I am truly King of England." It was a statement of liberation, for Walter had been a restraining hand, a voice of caution. But in celebrating the loss of his most capable servant, John was unwittingly opening the door to his most formidable enemy. The conflict that follows is a chess match played not for territory, but for the soul of the kingdom. It centres on a simple question: who gets to choose the new archbishop? John, naturally, believes it is his royal right to appoint a loyal friend, a man who will not question the crown. The monks of Canterbury, protective of their ancient privileges, secretly elect their own candidate. But in Rome, sitting on the throne of Saint Peter, is Pope Innocent III. Innocent is not a man to be trifled with. He is perhaps the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages, a man with a vision of papal authority that places the church above all earthly kings. He rejects both the king's man and the monk's man. Instead, he reaches into the lecture halls of the University of Paris and selects Stephen Langton. Langton is a brilliant choice for the church and a disastrous one for John. He is a scholar, a theologian, a man of immense intellect. He is the one who famously divided the Bible into the chapters we use today. But to John, Langton is a threat. He has lived in Paris. He has breathed the air of the enemy's capital. He is a friend of Philip Augustus. John refuses to let him land in England. He digs in his heels, his paranoia flaring like a torch. He declares that no Italian priest will tell the King of England who sits in Canterbury. The standoff stretches on, a battle of wills between the spiritual father of Christendom and the stubborn son of Henry II. In 1208, Innocent III plays his ace. He pronounces an interdict upon the realm of England. To the modern mind, this might sound like a bureaucratic sanction, a diplomatic slap on the wrist. But to the medieval mind, it is a nuclear winter of the soul. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of Sunday morning in the 12th century. It is a soundscape defined by bells, bells calling the faithful to Mass, bells marking the hours, bells tolling for the dead. The bell is the heartbeat of the community. And suddenly, on the Pope's order, the heart stops beating. The interdict forbids all public church services. The church doors are locked and barred. The altars are stripped of their cloths and candles. The crucifixes are covered in black veils. For more than 6 years, the bells of England do not ring. Imagine the psychological weight of that silence. In a world where every storm, every sickness, and every harvest is governed by the will of God, the suspension of the sacraments feels like being abandoned in a dark forest without a lantern. The impact on daily life is eerie and unsettling. Marriages cannot be solemnized in the church. Couples must exchange their vows in the church porch or the graveyard, whispering their promises in the shadow of the locked doors. Mass is not celebrated. The bread and wine are not transformed. Most horrifying of all, the dead cannot be given a Christian burial in consecrated ground. The churchyards are closed. Historians tell us that bodies were buried in ditches, in woods, or on the edges of towns, without the comforting rituals that promise safe passage to the afterlife. It is a time of spiritual twilight, where the boundary between the saved and the damned feels terrifyingly thin. And how does King John react to this spiritual siege? Does he fall to his knees? Does he beg for forgiveness? No, John calculates. He looks at the locked churches and sees an opportunity. If the priests are not performing their duties, he reasons, then they do not need their incomes. With a ruthless efficiency that would almost be admirable if it weren't so cynical, John confiscates the revenues of the clergy who observe the interdict. He seizes the lands of the bishops who flee the country. The millstone of the exchequer grinds on, crushing the church to extract its gold. There is a dark, humorous absurdity to John's retaliation. In the Middle Ages, many parish priests, though officially celibate, lived with women, housekeepers, who were wives in all but name. John, knowing this, orders the arrest of these women. He locks them up and demands that the priests pay a ransom to get their housekeepers back. It is extortion, pure and simple, but it works. The priests pay up. The king's coffers, so empty after the loss of Normandy, begin to fill again. The interdict, meant to break the king, actually makes him rich. It is a paradox that Innocent III likely did not foresee. John discovers that being a pariah can be incredibly profitable. Historians still argue about the true mood of the common people during these years. Did they blame the king for their spiritual peril, or did they resent the Pope for using their souls as bargaining chips? The evidence is murky. There were no mass uprisings, no riots in the streets demanding the return of the mass. Life, it seems, has a stubborn way of continuing. The peasant still ploughed the fields. The merchant still traded wool. The absence of the church perhaps revealed a startling truth, that the crown was a more immediate reality than the distant thunders of Rome. In 1209, the Pope escalates the conflict. He excommunicates John personally. This is the ultimate severance. The king is now officially cut off from the body of Christ. By the laws of the church, his subjects are technically absolved of their oaths of loyalty to him. A Christian is not bound to serve a heretic or an outcast. This should be the end of John. But John treats the excommunication with a terrifying indifference. He continues to hunt, to feast, and to rule. There is a story that captures his attitude perfectly. While hunting, a stag is brought down, fat and healthy. John laughs and says, "Look how fat this beast is," and yet he has never heard Mass. It is the joke of a man who has decided that if he is going to hell, he might as well enjoy the ride. Yet, beneath the bravado, the isolation is dangerous. John is now a lone wolf in Europe. He has no allies. The French king is preparing to invade, styling himself as the soldier of the church, coming to depose the wicked tyrant. The spiritual silence of the bells is matched by the diplomatic silence of John's neighbours. He is an island within an island. The wealth he is stripping from the church buys him mercenaries, but it cannot buy him peace of mind. The atmosphere of England in the interdict is one of suspended animation. It is a land holding its breath. The stone gargoyles on the church eaves stare down at a people who walk with their heads a little lower. The lack of ritual leaves a void that is filled with superstition. People see omens in the flight of birds. They hear warnings in the wind. The king travels the country, richer than he has ever been, his baggage train heavy with silver taken from the altars, but he is riding through a landscape that feels hollowed out. As we drift through this silent chapter, we feel the tension of a string pulled too tight. The king has withstood the Pope's greatest weapon, but the victory is hollow. He has shown that a king can survive without the church, but he has also shown his barons that he respects no law but his own. He has broken the triangle of king, church, and people. The gold in his treasury is cold comfort when the sky above feels like lead. We leave this section in the quiet of a Sunday morning, where the only sound is the wind in the trees, a ghostly reminder of the bells that should be ringing. The king sits in his counting house, stacking coins, while outside the spiritual winter deepens, and the long road to Runnymede grows a little shorter, paved with the broken stones of the church. We move now from the silence of the church to the scratching of the quill and the heavy clink of silver, for while the bells of England may be still, the counting houses of King John are deafeningly loud. If the interdict was a spiritual winter, the financial regime of the later years of John's reign is a scorching harvest, where the king seeks to reap every stalk of grain, every copper penny, and every hidden asset in the realm. We enter the era of the predatory court, where the machinery of the common law, once the pride of Henry II, is repurposed into a terrifying engine of extraction. Imagine walking through the royal forests of England in this time. The trees are ancient oaks and beeches, their canopies thick and green, filtering the sunlight into dappled pools on the mossy floor. It looks like a paradise, but to the common man, it is a trap. The forest in medieval law is not just a botanical description, it is a legal boundary. Within these vast tracts of land, which cover nearly a third of the kingdom, the king's will is absolute. The deer, the boar, and the hare belong to him alone. To be caught with a bow and arrow here is to risk blinding or castration, but John sees the forest not just as a hunting ground, but as a bank account. He expands the boundaries, claiming woods that have been free for generations. He levies fines on villages for encroachments, for clearing a few feet of scrub to plant turnips, or for gathering fallen branches to heat a hovel. The forest heirs, special courts set up to enforce these laws, travel the country like a plague of locusts, fining everyone in their path. The very leaves on the trees seem to whisper the king's demand for money. But the forest is just the beginning. The true genius of John's extortion lies in the courts of Westminster. Historians often debate whether John was a tyrant or simply a brilliant, if ruthless, administrator. The records of the Exchequer suggest he was a bit of both. He knows the law better than his judges, and he knows exactly how to twist it. In a normal legal system, you pay a fee to have your case heard. In John's system, you pay a fee to have your case heard quickly. Or, if you are feeling spiteful, you pay a larger fee to have your neighbour's case heard slowly. Justice becomes a commodity, auctioned off to the highest bidder. There are records of barons paying the king 2 palfreys, gentle riding horses, or a ton of wine, just to have the king's benevolence. A polite way of saying, please don't ruin me. The most vulnerable targets of this financial dragnet are those who legally belong to the king, the widows and the heirs. In feudal law, when a baron dies, his land and his family revert to the custody of the crown until the heir comes of age or the widow remarries. John turns this guardianship into a racketeering operation. He sells the right to marry wealthy widows to his favourite mercenaries. Imagine the indignity. A noble woman, grieving her husband, suddenly finding herself sold like a prize cow to a rough soldier she has never met, simply because he paid the king 500 marks. But John, ever the innovator, offers a second option. The widow can pay a fine to the king for the privilege of not marrying. There are heartbreaking entries in the royal rolls where women pay enormous sums for liberty to remain single. Or it is a tax on solitude, a price tag on peace of mind. And then there is the Jewish community. In medieval England, the Jews hold a precarious legal status. They are the king's chattel, technically the personal property of the crown. They are under his protection, which means no one else can harm them, but it also means the king can do with them whatever he pleases. They are the honeybees of the economy, allowed to lend money at interest, which Christians are forbidden to do, gathering wealth that the king intends to harvest. In 1210, desperate for funds to reconquer Normandy, John turns on them with a ferocious appetite. He demands a tallage, a tax, of 66,000 marks from the Jewish community. It is a staggering, impossible sum. There is a famous grim story from this time that captures the horror of John's desperation. It concerns a wealthy Jewish merchant in Bristol who refused to pay his assessed share. John ordered his teeth to be pulled out, one by one, day by day, until he paid. The story goes that the merchant endured the agony for 7 days, losing 7 teeth, before finally breaking on the 8th day and paying the money to save the rest. Whether this is literal truth or a dark legend amplified by chroniclers who loathed the king, it speaks to the atmosphere of the time. The king's treasury is filled not just with gold, but with teeth, with tears, and with the broken promises of protection. Yet, we must be careful not to paint John as a mindless thug. He is a bureaucratic thug. Everything is recorded. The clerks of the Exchequer are working overtime. They use tally sticks, hazel wands, with notches carved into them to represent sums of money. The stick is split down the middle, with the creditor keeping one half and the debtor the other. When the debt is paid, the 2 halves are matched together to prove the transaction. The basements of Westminster are piling high with these wooden receipts, a dry, brittle forest of debt that underpins the king's power. John is micromanaging it all. He sits with the sheriffs demanding to know why the revenue from a particular shire is down by 3 shillings. He creates a camera, a private treasury that travels with him, so he can have immediate access to his cash, bypassing the slow procedures of the main exchequer. He wants to feel the coins in his hands. This relentless pressure works, in a sense. By 1212, John has amassed a war chest that is truly formidable. He is arguably the richest king in English history up to that point. He has barrels of silver stored in Corfe Castle, in Devizes, in Bristol. He has the money to buy an army, to buy allies, to buy back his empire. But he has made a fatal miscalculation. He has confused wealth with power. He has drained the kingdom of coin, but he has also drained it of goodwill. He has treated his barons not as partners in the governance of the realm, but as sponges to be squeezed dry. The atmosphere in the baronial halls is shifting from grumbling to conspiracy. In the north of England, far from the king's immediate reach, the Northerners, as group of hard-bitten lords who have little patience for John's southern intrigues, begin to talk. They look at their depleted coffers and their ravaged woods, and they wonder, is a king who breaks the law still a king? They begin to dig through their own archives, looking for old charters, for the promises made by Henry the Mayor a century ago. They are looking for a precedent, a shield to hold up against this weaponized legal system. As we watch the coins pile up in John's treasury, gleaming in the torchlight, we can almost see the reflection of the coming fire. John is building a mountain of gold, but he is standing on a fault line. The widows who paid for their freedom, the merchants who lost their teeth, the barons who lost their woods, they are all waiting. The tragedy of John's financial wizardry is that he is efficient enough to be hated, but not strong enough to be invulnerable. He has bought his army, but he has sold his legitimacy. Let the scene fade on the image of a tally stick, split down the middle. It is a symbol of a contract, of 2 sides fitting together. But in John's England, the stick is splintering. The king holds one half, the people hold the other, and they no longer fit. The wood is dry, and the air is full of sparks. The treasury of teeth is full, but the king is about to find that he cannot buy loyalty with fear, and that a toothless smile hides a dangerous tongue. The wind blows differently in the north of England. If the air in Westminster is thick with ink and intrigue, the air in Northumberland is sharp, smelling of heather, cold rain, and the ancient stone of Hadrian's Wall. We must now travel away from the suffocating intimacy of John's court, riding north along the Great North Road until the manicured lawns of the south give way to the rugged, untamed moors. It is here, in the draughty great halls of castles like Alnwick and Warkworth, that the first true storm clouds of the rebellion begin to gather. These are the lands of the Northerners, a distinct breed of baron who will become the engine of the Magna Carta crisis. To understand why the charter happened, you must understand these men. They are not the silk-clad courtiers who whisper in the king's ear. They are marcher lords, men who sleep with one eye open, guarding the border against the Scots. They are accustomed to violence, they are fiercely independent, and they have a very low tolerance for a king who demands their money but loses their wars. The year is 1212, turning into 1213, and the mood in the north is one of sullen, dangerous quiet. The Northerners, men like Eustace de Vesey and the fiery Robert Fitzwalter, who, though he holds lands in Essex, shares their hard-bitten spirit, feel a double sting. First, there is the money. They have paid the scutage, the shield tax, time and time again, for John's campaigns in France, campaigns that never seem to happen or end in a humiliation. They are paying for a war that is not being fought. But beneath the financial grievance lies something more personal, something that festers like an infected wound. It is the issue of trust and honour. King John has a reputation, whispered in every tavern and solar, for being a man who does not respect the sanctity of his subjects' families. There is a persistent legend from this time, one that historians treat with caution, but which carries the emotional truth of the era concerning John's pursuit of the wives and daughters of his barons. The chroniclers tell us that John was brimful of evil qualities, and one of his most dangerous habits was his lust. The story goes that John set his sights on the wife of Eustace de Vesey, a beautiful and virtuous woman. The king, using the ring trick, a common deception in courtly romances, where a husband's signet ring is sent to his wife as a summons, attempted to lure her to his bed. But de Vesey, wise to the king's character, intercepted the message. In a moment of grim, dark humour that likely elicited a roar of laughter in the northern halls, de Vesey did not send his wife. Instead, he hired a common prostitute, dressed her in his wife's finest velvet gown, and sent her into the dark royal bedchamber. The king, none the wiser in the gloom, spent the night with the woman, and allegedly boasted about it to de Vesey the next morning. When de Vesey revealed the switch, the king's humiliation was absolute, and his rage was volcanic. Whether this specific event happened exactly as written is less important than the fact that the barons believed it could. It paints a picture of a king who viewed his subjects not as people, but as property to be used. But the rebellion of the northerners is not just about scandal, it is about the rediscovery of an idea. Amidst the whispers of treason, a new conversation begins to circulate, carried perhaps by the secret messengers of Stephen Langton, the exiled archbishop. It is a conversation about the past. In the dusty archives of monasteries and cathedral libraries, men begin to look for a piece of parchment that has been forgotten for 100 years. It is the coronation charter of Henry the Fern, the Charter of Liberties issued in 1100. This is a pivotal moment in our story, the moment when anger transforms into ideology. Henry the Second, the son of the Conqueror, had issued this charter to buy the loyalty of his barons, promising to renounce the evil customs of his predecessor and to rule according to the law. It had been largely ignored by subsequent kings, buried under the weight of the Angevin bureaucracy. But now, as the northerners look for a weapon to fight John, they dust it off. They read the faded Latin script. I, Henry, by the grace of God, restore to you the law of King Edward. It is a revelation. They realize that they are not asking for something new. They are asking for the restoration of something old. They are not revolutionaries trying to overturn the world. They are conservatives trying to reset the clock. This distinction is crucial. It gives them the moral high ground. They are not rebels. They are restorers. The atmosphere in these northern meetings is heavy with conspiracy. Imagine a council of war held not in a tent, but in the crypt of a church, the air cold and smelling of incense and damp stone. The barons speak in low voices. They touch the hilt of their swords. They are terrified, for treason is a death sentence. John is known for his cruelty. He has starved the wife and son of William de Braose to death in the dungeons of Corfe Castle, a horror story that every baron knows by heart. To defy John is to risk everything, yet the fear of the king is slowly being outweighed by the fear of losing their own dignity and rights. Into this volatile mix steps a figure who seems to have walked straight out of a myth, Peter of Wakefield. He is a hermit, a wild-eyed prophet from Yorkshire who begins to preach a terrifying message. He claims to have had a vision that King John will lose his crown by the next Ascension Day, the anniversary of Christ's rising to heaven. The prophecy spreads like wildfire. In a world governed by signs and wonders, this is not just a rumour. It is a forecast. The common people stop and listen. The soldiers mutter in the garrisons. Is the king cursed? John, naturally, is furious. He has Peter arrested and dragged in chains to Corfe Castle. He demands to know the source of the prophecy. Peter simply repeats it. By Ascension Day, you will be no king. John waits. The days tick by, filled with a tension that tightens the chest. Ascension, day 12R13 arrives. The sun rises, and John is still on the throne. The prophecy, it seems, was false. In a fit of vengeful relief, John orders Peter of Wakefield to be dragged by horses to the gallows and hanged, along with his son. It is a brutal execution, meant to silence the superstitious whispers. But here is the twist, the kind of irony that history loves to script. On the very eve of Ascension Day, in a desperate bid to end his excommunication and gain the Pope's support against the looming French invasion, John had performed a secret ceremony. He had surrendered his crown to the Pope's legate, Pandulph, and received it back as a feudal vassal of Rome. Technically, for a few brief moments or hours, John was no king. He had given away his sovereignty to keep his power. The hermit, in a twisted, legalistic sense, had been right. The people nod knowingly. The king has kept his title, but he has lost his independence. He is now the Pope's man. The Northerners watch all of this with a mixture of disgust and opportunity. The king is weak, he is bowed to Rome, he is terrified of prophecies, and he is planning yet another campaign in France. When John summons the feudal host to sail to Poitou in 1213, the Northerners play their hand. They refuse to go. They claim, with a lawyerly stubbornness, that the terms of their land tenure do not require them to serve overseas. We are bound to fight in England, they say, not in the swamps of Poitou. It is a direct challenge to the king's authority. John rages. He threatens to march north and burn their castles. He gathers his mercenaries. But he is stopped by Stephen Langton, now back in England, after the king's reconciliation with the Pope. Langton, the intellectual heavyweight, steps between the king and the rebels. You cannot make war on your own subjects without a judgment of the court, he warns John. That is the law. The king pauses. He looks at the archbishop. He looks at the sullen, armed north, and he blinks. He realises he cannot fight a civil war and a French war at the same time. He backs down, but the silence that follows is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a fuse burning down. The Northerners have defied the king and survived. They have tasted their own power. The whispers in the drafty halls have stopped being whispers. They are becoming oaths. The parchment of Henry I's charter is being copied and circulated, hidden in saddlebags and secreted in doublets. The idea has taken root. As the winter of 1213 sets in, the fires in the hearths of the north burn bright, illuminating the faces of men who have decided that the time for talking is almost over. The king may have his mercenaries, but the barons have something stronger. They have a precedent. And in England, a precedent is a dangerous thing. The year is 1214, and the fate of England is about to be decided not on its own green soil, but on a hot, dusty plain in Flanders, hundreds of miles away. This is the moment of the great gamble. King John, having spent years hoarding gold, squeezing widows, and enduring the silence of the church, finally plays his hand. He has built a grand alliance, a diplomatic masterpiece designed to crush the French king, Philip Augustus, in a giant pincer movement. It is a strategy of elegant, lethal geometry. John will land in the south of France, drawing Philip's armies toward him, while his allies, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto Thorso and the Count of Flanders, will strike from the north, marching straight for Paris. On paper, it is brilliant. On paper, John is already the victor. But history, as we know, is not written on paper. It is written in the mud. John departs for France in February, his ships laden with treasure chests to pay his mercenaries. There is a sense of finality to this campaign. He knows, and his barons know, that he cannot return empty-handed again. He lands in La Rochelle, and for a brief season, the old Angevin magic seems to return. John marches inland, reclaiming territory, moving with a speed and confidence that surprises his enemies. He is not soft-sword now, he is the son of Henry II, but as he pushes north, the old demons of distrust resurface. His Poitevin allies are fickle. When he encounters the French prince, Louis, blocking his path, John's nerve fails him. He refuses to fight a pitched battle. He retreats. He waits. The southern arm of the pincer has stalled. All eyes now turn to the north. It is Sunday, the 27th of July, 1214. The location is Bouvines, a small village near Lille, surrounded by open fields that are baking under the intense heat of high summer. The air shimmers above the cornfields. The crickets are loud in the grass. By the unspoken rules of medieval warfare, there should be no fighting today. It is the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, a day for prayer and rest. But the Emperor Otto, leading the coalition forces, believes he has caught the French king at a disadvantage. He orders the attack. The truce of God is broken, and the silence of the Sunday is shattered by the thunder of a massive cavalry charge. The Battle of Bouvines is one of the few truly decisive battles of the Middle Ages. It is a clash of titans, a swirling chaotic melee of thousands of knights and infantrymen. The dust rises in choking clouds, coating the brightly coloured surcoats of the knights in a uniform grey. The sun beats down on the metal helmets, turning the armour into ovens. Men faint from heat exhaustion before a single blow is struck. In the centre of the fray, King Philip Augustus is pulled from his horse by German infantrymen using hooked pikes. He hits the ground, vulnerable, the hooves of war horses thundering inches from his head. For a moment, the history of France hangs by a thread, but his knights rally. They cut their way to him, haul him back into the saddle, and the tide begins to turn. The coalition fights bravely, but they are disjointed. The French knights, fighting for their king and their homeland, strike with a unified fury. The Count of Flanders is captured. The Emperor Otto, seeing his army crumbling, flees the field, his imperial eagle standard captured and broken. By the time the sun begins to set, casting long bloody shadows across the trampled wheat, the result is clear. Philip Augustus has won a total victory. The Grand Alliance is smashed. The pincer has snapped shut on empty air. John is not at Bouvines. He is hundreds of miles away in the south when the news arrives. We can only imagine the scene. A dusty messenger, perhaps exhausted and terrified, kneeling before the king to deliver the catastrophe. The psychological blow is heavier than any physical wound. The entire strategy, the years of taxation, the extracted teeth, the starving prisoners, the diplomatic manoeuvring, it has all been for nothing. The gamble has failed. John is not just defeated, he is exposed. The cloak of fear that he used to control his barons is stripped away. A king who wins can be forgiven almost anything. A king who loses, and loses this badly, is nothing but a man with a crown, and a heavy one at that. The return to England in October 1214 is a sombre affair. The autumn gales buffet the royal ship, a fitting, pathetic fallacy for a reign in turmoil. John lands to find a kingdom that has changed in his absence. The fear has evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The barons who refused to sail, the northerners who stayed behind, now feel vindicated. They were right not to follow a loser. They look at the king and see a bankrupt adventurer, and John, true to his nature, makes the worst possible move. Instead of offering conciliation, he demands money. He orders the collection of the scutage, the tax in lieu of military service, from the very barons who refuse to fight. He sets the rate at an unprecedented 3 marks per knight. It is a demand that screams of delusion. He is asking them to pay for the privilege of his failure. The atmosphere in the country shifts from passive resistance to active conspiracy. The meetings are no longer held in secret crypts, They are held in the open under the guise of pilgrimages and prayer meetings. One such meeting takes place at the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds in November. The barons gather at the shrine of the martyr King St Edmund. The legend says that under the pretext of prayer they swore a holy oath on the high altar. One by one, they stepped forward, men like Robert Fitzwalter, Eustace de Vesey, Richard de Clare, Geoffrey de Mandeville. They swore that if King John refused to restore the laws and liberties of Edward the Confessor and Henry the Serns, they would withdraw their fealty and make war on him until he sealed a charter confirming their rights. This is the moment the rebellion becomes a movement. It is solemn, ritualistic, and deeply serious. They are not anarchists, they are bringing the king to justice. They cloak their treason in the language of holiness. They are the army of God and the Holy Church. It is a brilliant branding move. They have taken the moral high ground, leaving John down in the mud of his own making. The winter of 1214, 1215 is a season of waiting. The roads are frozen hard. The trees are bare skeletons against the grey sky. John is at the temple in London, surrounded by his mercenaries, but he feels the walls closing in. He tries to buy time. He tries to buy the Pope, sending desperate letters to Innocent III, pledging himself as a crusader. By taking the cross, he places himself under the special protection of the Church. To attack a crusader is a grave sin. It is a clever, cynical, legal manoeuvre, a get-out-of-jail-free card played by a man who knows the rule-book better than anyone. But the barons are past caring about legal technicalities. The momentum of history has shifted. The defeat at Bouvines was the earthquake. Now comes the tsunami. Historians often pause here to reflect on the what-ifs. If John had won at Bouvines, there would likely be no Magna Carta. The Angevin Empire might have survived. The absolute monarchy of the Tudors or the Bourbons might have arrived in England 3 centuries early. But the mud of Flanders decided otherwise. The failure of the king created the necessity of the law. It is a strange paradox. The foundation of English liberty rests on a French victory. As we drift towards the end of this section, visualize the king in the dim light of the temple church. He is pacing the round nave, the effigies of knights looking up at him from the floor. He is cornered. He has no money, no allies, and no victory to hide behind. Outside, the wind howls through the narrow streets of London, carrying the voices of a discontented city. The merchants, the mayors, the commoners, they are watching. The king is alone, and somewhere in the darkness of the countryside, the iron-clad barons are mounting their horses. They are coming not to ask, but to demand. The road to Runnymede is open. The winter frost has melted, retreating into the soaked earth, and the English spring of 1215 arrives not with the gentle unfolding of blossoms, but with the sharp snap of broken seals. The time for waiting is over. We are now witnessing the march to the meadow, a journey that transforms a localized rebellion into a national revolution. It begins in late April, when the barons finally cross the Rubicon, or rather, the boundaries of their own patience. At Stamford and then at Brackley, they formally renounce their fealty to King John. This is a moment of supreme legal and spiritual danger. To renounce fealty is to break the sacred bond that holds the medieval world together. It is to say, "You are no longer my lord," which, by the logic of the day, makes the barons outlaws. They appoint Robert Fitzwalter, a man of questionable character but undeniable charisma, as their leader, styling him with the grand thundering title of Marshal of the Army of God and the Holy Church. It is a title that wraps their treason in the protective cloak of a crusade. They are not fighting the king, they are fighting for God, or so the branding goes. The initial military moves are clumsy. The barons lay siege to the royal castle at Northampton and fail miserably. They lack the siege engines, the engineers, and perhaps the stomach for a long, grinding war. John, watching from a distance, likely allows himself a smirk. He knows that castles are hard to take, and that rebel coalitions are easy to break. Time is on his side. All he has to do is wait for them to run out of food or money. But then the board flips. The rebels receive a secret message from the most important city in the realm, London. London in 1215 is a bustling, smelly, crowded metropolis of perhaps 40,000 souls, tiny by modern standards, but a giant in the medieval landscape. It is the heart of commerce, the wallet of the kingdom. And London is angry. The merchants have been taxed to the breaking point. The poor are squeezed by the king's sheriffs. The city is a powder keg waiting for a spark. On Sunday morning, May 17th, while the citizens are at Mass, the rebel army arrives at the gates. The moment is cinematic in its anticlimax. There is no battering ram, no storm of arrows. The gates simply swing open. The barons ride in, their horses' hooves clattering on the cobbles. Not as conquerors, but as welcome guests. They secure the city with barely a skirmish. This is the checkmate. With London in their hands, the barons have legitimacy. They have the money of the merchants and the strategic control of the capital. John, who is currently at Windsor Castle, just 20 miles to the west, suddenly finds himself cut off. He has lost his capital. He has lost his treasury. He has lost the initiative. The smirk vanishes. He realizes, with the cold clarity of a survivor, that he cannot win this by force. He is surrounded by a kingdom that has turned its back on him. The soft sword must now become the diplomat. John sends out messengers. He issues safe conducts. He signals that he is ready to talk. But where? They cannot meet at Windsor. It is a fortress, too dangerous for the barons. They cannot meet in London. It is a rebel stronghold, too dangerous for the king. They need a neutral ground, a no-man's land between the royal castle and the rebel city. And so, history's finger points to a patch of water meadow beside the River Thames, a place called Runnymede. Historians and etymologists still argue delightfully over the name Runnymede. Some suggest it means regular mead, a place where the river runs smoothly. But a more poetic and perhaps more accurate theory links it to the Old English word run, meaning a secret or a council, the meadow of the council. It is possible that for centuries, long before the Normans brought their stone castles and French laws, the Anglo-Saxon kings held open-air assemblies here. It is a place that feels ancient. It is a floodplain, too wet for building, too flat for an ambush. It is a space designed by nature for transparency. You can see everyone coming. There are no trees to hide an assassin, no cliffs to hide an archer. It is a stage of grass and sky. As the month of June warms the air, the roads leading to Runnymede become choked with traffic. Imagine the scene. It is not just two men meeting, it is two courts colliding. From the west, from Windsor, comes the King's party. It is a small, tight group. The loyalists, the mercenaries, the papal legate Pandulf, and the Archbishop Stephen Langton, who is acting as the mediator, the bridge between the two sides. They bring the royal pavilions, the great seals, the scribes. From the east, from London, comes the army of God. It is a sprawling, chaotic, colourful procession of barons, knights, squires and servants. Their armour is polished, their banners are snapping in the breeze, banners of blue, gold and scarlet displaying the heraldry of the greatest families in England, the Bigods, the de Clares, the de Bohuns. The atmosphere is a strange blend of a festival and a funeral. There is the smell of roasting meat from the campfires, the sound of lutes and laughter, but underneath it all runs a current of deadly seriousness. These men are technically at war. If the talks fail, the swords will be drawn, and the grass of Runnymede will be stained red. But for now, the weapons are sheathed. The talk is of ink, not blood. In the days leading up to the great meeting, a document has been circulating. It is known as the Articles of the Barons. It is a rough draft, a laundry list of grievances scribbled down in anger and refined in committee. It is not a polished constitution, it is a demand note. The king will do this, the king will stop doing that. It demands the return of hostages, the end of exorbitant fines, the removal of foreign mercenaries. It is a practical, messy, selfish list. There are no grand declarations about the rights of man, not yet. These are landlords wanting their rent stabilised, but hidden within these demands are the seeds of something universal. The geography of the location adds to the drama. The Thames flows silently past, a silver witness to the proceedings. On the opposite bank, the trees of Ankerwicker Yew, a tree already ancient in 1215, stand sentinel. The air is filled with the buzzing of insects and the calls of waterfowl. It is a reminder that while kings and barons argue over who owns the land itself persists, indifferent and enduring. The ground is soft, spongy, with the river's overflow. It is a humble place for such a high-stakes drama. John sets up his camp. He is outwardly calm, perhaps even charming. He is playing a role. He knows he has to sign something to buy time. He views this whole affair as a temporary humiliation, a storm to be weathered until the Pope can bail him out. He does not believe in the permanence of what is about to happen. He sees the meadow as a trap to be escaped. The barons, on the other hand, see it as an altar. They are there to bind the king, to tie him down with ropes of parchment so strong that he can never break free again. As we stand on the edge of the meadow, watching the pavilions rise like colourful mushrooms in the mist, we can feel the weight of the moment. It is June 10th, roughly. The preliminary negotiations are beginning. Messengers ride back and forth between the camps. The lawyers, the unsung heroes of this story, are sharpening their quills. Stephen Langton is moving between the king's tent and the baron's tent, his robes swishing through the long grass, trying to turn angry demands into legal Latin. He is the midwife of the charter, smoothing the edges, finding the words that both sides can swallow. The sun sets over the Thames, turning the river to liquid gold. The fires are lit. The voices are hushed. The waiting is the hardest part. The king sits in his tent, nursing a cup of wine, listening to the murmur of the rebel army just a few hundred yards away. He is outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of time. The march to the meadow is over. The talking is about to begin, and in the silence of the English night, the future of democracy is holding its breath, waiting for the stroke of a pen. The sun rises over the Thames Valley, burning off the river mist to reveal a spectacle that has transformed the quiet water meadow into a bustling, fluttering city of cloth. We are now deep in the days of negotiation, the middle of June 1215, a period suspended in a strange, humid tension. Runnymede has become a holy ground, not through the consecration of a bishop, but through the convergence of history. It is a tent city, a temporary capital of England made of canvas, rope, and timber stakes driven into the soft, yielding earth. If you were to walk through the long grass, your boots damp with dew, you would hear the sounds of a kingdom arguing with itself. It is a low, constant hum, punctuated by the whinny of a tethered horse or the sharp command of a steward. The visual contrast between the two camps is striking, a physical manifestation of the political divide. On one side, near the riverbank, stands the royal pavilion of King John. It is a masterpiece of travelling luxury, silk dyed in rich purples and crimsons, embroidered with the golden lions of the Plantagenets. Inside, the ground is covered with thick carpets to keep the royal feet off the mud. The air smells of expensive beeswax candles and the spices of wine. Here, the king holds court, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, men like William Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke, an elderly statesman, who is arguably the greatest knight who ever lived, now serving as the adult in the room for a petulant monarch. John sits on a folding chair of state, his face a mask of bored politeness. He's playing a game of patience. He jokes with his clerks, he strokes his beard, he acts as though this is merely a minor administrative inconvenience rather than the dismantling of his absolute power. But watch his hands. They are restless, constantly toying with his rings or the hem of his robe. He hates the smell of this place. He hates the damp that seeps into his bones. Most of all, he hates the sight of the other camp. Across the meadow, the rebel barons have pitched their tents. This is a military encampment, functional and crowded. There are no silk carpets here, just straw scattered over the beaten earth. The air smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and unwashed men in chainmail. The barons are a mixed bag of idealists, opportunists, and thugs, united only by their shared grievances. There is Robert Fitzwalter, styling himself the Marshal of the Army of God, strutting like a peacock. There is Geoffrey de Mandeville, angry about the exorbitant relief he had to pay for his wife's inheritance. They are loud, they are confident, and they are armed. But they are also nervous. They know that if these talks fail, the next step is not a debate, but a massacre. They sleep with their swords within reach, and every rustle of the wind in the willows sounds like a royal ambush. Between these two armed camps, moving like a shuttle in a loom, is the figure of Stephen Langton. If Magna Carta has a father, it is this exhausted Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the intellectual engine of Runnymede. Historians often debate the true authorship of the Charter. Was it the Baron's demands or the King's concessions? The truth is likely found in Langton's satchel. He is the one translating the angry shouts of the barons into the cool, precise Latin of the law. He walks back and forth across the meadow, his robes trailing in the grass, carrying drafts and counter-drafts. He is the mediator, the translator, and the peacekeeper. He reminds the king of his coronation oath. He reminds the barons of the need for moderation. He is trying to weave a net that will catch the king without strangling the kingdom. The work of negotiation is not cinematic in the way a battle is. It is grinding, pedantic, and slow. It is haggling over ink. The barons present a demand. The king must stop seizing wood for his castles. The king's clerks counter. The king needs wood for national defence. Langton suggests a compromise. The king may take wood, but he must pay a fair price immediately. And so it goes, clause by clause, hour by hour. The scribes are the unsung heroes here, sitting at portable desks, their fingers stained with gall ink, scratching out the terms on scraps of parchment. The heat in the tents is stifling. Flies, attracted by the horses and the refuse, buzz incessantly around the heads of the most powerful men in England. It is a very human scene. You can imagine the Earl of Warren swatting a mosquito while debating the rights of widows, or the king complaining about the quality of the wine while signing away his right to levy arbitrary taxes. One of the fascinating scholarly debates about these few days concerns a mysterious document known as the Unknown Charter. Discovered centuries later in the French archives, it appears to be a bridge between the old charter of Henry I and the final Magna Carta. It suggests that the negotiations were fluid, that drafts were being sent to France for King Philip to see, that the conversation was international. It reminds us that Runnymede was not a closed bubble. The whole of Europe was watching. The Pope, Innocent III, is a silent, distant presence in every conversation. John knows that whatever he agrees to here, he can ask the Pope to annul later. This secret knowledge gives him the confidence to agree to things that seem suicidal to his power. He is writing checks he intends to bounce. The document that is slowly taking shape is not yet called Magna Carta. At this stage, it is simply the Charter of Liberties. It is a hodgepodge of specific grievances and grand principles. It deals with fish weirs in the Thames. They must be removed. With the standard width of cloth, it must be 2 ells within the lists. And with the rights of Jewish moneylenders, debts do not accumulate interest during a minority. It is a practical document, grounded in the mud and commerce of daily life. But amidst the regulations about fish and cloth, Langton and the lawyers are slipping in the dynamite, the concepts of law of the land and judgment of peers. These are the hidden seeds. The barons think they are securing their property. Langton knows he is securing the future. The atmosphere at night is particularly evocative. The fires of the 2 camps mirror each other across the darkness. The river reflects the starlight. In the barons' camp, the talk is boisterous, fueled by ale and adrenaline. They are winning. They have brought the king to the table. In the royal camp, the mood is sombre. The clerks are exhausted, their eyes red from reading by candlelight. John is awake, pacing. He is a man who rarely sleeps well. And here, surrounded by his enemies, sleep is a stranger. He looks at the draft charters, the piles of parchment that seek to bind him. He sees them as chains. He reads the clause that establishes a council of 25 barons to watch over him, a security clause that effectively puts the king under guardianship. It is a humiliation. Chroniclers say he gnawed on sticks of wood in his fury when he thought no one was looking. Yet outwardly, the progress continues. The rough articles of the barons are polished into the smooth, legalistic charter. The language becomes formal, majestic. John, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy. The irony of the titles is sharp. He is Duke of Normandy, but he has lost Normandy. He is Lord of Ireland, but he has barely visited it. He is King of England, but he is currently a prisoner in all but name. The preamble lists the witnesses, the bishops, the earls who have stayed loyal. It is a fiction of unity. The document claims to be granted out of our own free will, a phrase that must have choked John as he allowed it to be written. As June 15th approaches, the tension reaches its peak, the haggling is done, the clerks have produced a final draft. The parchment is scraped clean, the skin of a sheep prepared to hold the weight of history. The ink is mixed, the wax is warmed, the mood in the meadow shifts from a marketplace to a courtroom. The holy ground is ready for the sacrament of law. The barons put on their best tunics, brushing the straw from their cloaks. The king puts on his crown, or at least the circle of gold he wears for state business. The air is heavy, expectant. The birdsong seems to pause. The treaty of the meadow is finished. We leave this section with the image of the 2 camps stirring on the morning of the 15th. The mist is lifting again. The smell of breakfast fires drifts on the breeze. Stephen Langton steps out of his tent, holding a roll of parchment. He looks tired, but there is a glimmer of triumph in his eyes. He has done the impossible. He has brought the king and the rebels to the point of agreement. Now, all that remains is the act itself. The tents of Runnymede have done their job. They have housed the birth of a new idea. The canvas flaps in the wind, a soft applause for the drama that is about to conclude. The ink is wet, the wax is soft, and the world is about to change. The sun has reached its zenith over the water meadow, and the heat inside the royal pavilion is heavy, smelling of crushed grass and the sweat of nervous men. It is Monday, the 15th of June, 12:15. We have arrived at the moment that has been painted, sculpted, and romanticised for 800 years, the sealing of Magna Carta. But erase from your mind the Victorian oil paintings of a king sitting at a desk, quill in hand, scowling as he scratches his name at the bottom of a scroll. That is a myth born of a later age. In the 13th century, a king does not sign, he seals. His power resides not in his signature, which might be nothing more than a shaky cross, but in the Great Seal of England, a heavy disc of beeswax that carries the imprint of his authority. The reality of this moment is far more industrial, far more ritualistic, and strangely, far more distant than a signature would imply. King John is seated on his chair of state, perhaps wearing a surcoat of light silk to combat the June humidity. He looks at the parchment spread out on the trestle table before him. It is a large, unassuming skin of sheep, treated with lime and scraped until it is smooth and cream-coloured. It is covered in the dense, abbreviated Latin of the Chancery clerks, block after block of text without paragraphs, a wall of words that walls him in. He likely does not read it now. The arguing is over, and the words are settled. He simply nods. It is a small gesture, a dip of the chin, but it changes the world. At a signal, the Spiegurnal, the official keeper of the sealing wax, steps forward. This is a moment of high technical theatre. The wax is not the red, brittle stick used for modern letters. It is a blend of beeswax and resin, coloured a natural green or uncoloured yellowish brown, kept soft in warm water or heated over a brazier until it has the consistency of stiff dough. The Spiegurnal takes a ball of this warm, pliable wax and places it around a silk cord or a strip of parchment that hangs from the bottom of the charter. He then takes the matrix of the Great Seal, a two-sided silver die, heavy and cold. He places the wax between the two halves of the matrix and squeezes them together with a powerful screw press or a heavy blow from a mallet. Close your eyes and listen. There is a thump, a squelch of wax, and then the creak of the press releasing. The seal is done. On one side it shows John in majesty, seated on a throne, holding a sword and an orb, the very image of the power he is currently struggling to keep. On the other side it shows him as a warrior, mounted on horseback, galloping with his sword drawn, the image of the commander he failed to be at Bouvines. It is a profound irony. The instrument used to limit the king's power is the very image of his absolute authority. The wax cools and hardens, locking the king's promise into a physical form. He is now bound. But here is a detail often missed in the retelling. This happens not just once, but dozens of times. Magna Carta is not a single document locked in a vault. It is a broadcast. As soon as the first seal is affixed, the Chancery scribes begin a marathon of copying. They must create exemplifications, official copies, to be sent to every sheriff and cathedral in England. The meadow of Runnymede becomes a factory of liberty. Can you hear the frantic scratching of the quills? Dozens of clerks are hunched over their portable desks, dipping their pens into oak gall ink, racing to duplicate the text. John, by the grace of God, over and over again. They are tired, their hands are cramping, and in their haste, they make mistakes. Words are skipped, spellings vary, lines are squeezed in at the bottom. The surviving copies of the 1215 Charter are not identical. They are human artifacts, bearing the fingerprints of exhausted men working in a field. For John, this proliferation of parchment must be a nightmare. Every copy that leaves the tent is another chain binding him. He watches the Spiegurnal work with a detached, hooded gaze. Historians and psychologists have long speculated on what was going on behind those eyes. Was he plotting his revenge, even as the wax was warm? Almost certainly. John is a man who regards an oath made under duress as no oath at all. He views this entire ceremony as a piece of theatre to satisfy the hecklers so he can get back to the business of ruling. He is buying time, paying for it with wax and sheepskin. There is a report, likely apocryphal, but emotionally true, that after the barons left, John threw himself on the ground and gnawed on straw in a fit of rage, screaming that he had been made a slave of 25 over-kings. But in the tent, Under the gaze of the archbishop and the rebel leaders, he remains the actor. He smiles. He offers the kiss of peace. He plays the role of the gracious sovereign granting liberties to his beloved subjects. The barons, for their part, are relieved but wary. They watch the sealing process like hawks. They know John's reputation. They know about the ring trick with Deveshi's wife. They know about the broken promises to the northern lords. They want to see the wax harden with their own eyes. They are not interested in the king's word. They are interested in the king's bond. The charter includes a mechanism for enforcement. Clause 61, the security clause. It creates a committee of 25 barons who have the legal right to distrain and distress the king, seize his castles and lands, if he breaks the agreement. It is effectively a legalised right to rebellion. As the seal is pressed, the barons must feel a grim satisfaction. They have not just asked for justice, they have created a machine to ensure it. The sensory atmosphere of the tent is a mix of the sacred and the profane. There is the smell of incense from the archbishop's robes, mingling with the smell of wet wool and horse manure from the outside. There is the murmur of Latin, the language of God and the law, and the rougher sounds of Norman French, the language of the aristocracy. The Great Seal itself smells of honey and pine resin. It is a tactile moment. The fate of the English Constitution is being decided by physical things: wax, parchment, ink, silver. It is grounded in the material world. As the afternoon wears on, the pile of sealed charters grows. Messengers are already mounting their horses, ready to carry the news to the four corners of the realm. To Lincoln, to Salisbury, to Durham, they will stand in the market squares and read the text aloud to people who cannot read, people who have never seen a king, people who only know that the taxes are too high and the sheriffs are too cruel. For the first time, the law is coming to them. The law of the land is moving out of the king's head and into the village green. But let us pause and look at the king one last time in this scene. He is tired. The adrenaline of the negotiation has faded, leaving a dull headache. He watches the backs of the barons as they leave the tent, their swords clinking against their armour. He is alone now with his clerks and his loyalists. The peace has been made. The sun is beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the meadow. The river flows on, indifferent. The king stands up, stretches his stiff back, and perhaps pours himself a cup of wine. He has survived the day, he has affixed his seal, but in his heart he knows the wax is brittle. He knows that parchment burns. He knows that the Pope is only a letter away. The pressing of the seal is not an ending, it is a pause. It is a deep breath before the plunge. The peace of Runnymede is a mirage, shimmering in the summer heat, beautiful to look at, but impossible to hold. The scene fades with the image of a single charter, rolled up and tied, resting on the table. The wax seal hangs from it, like a heavy pendulum. It captures the light of the flickering candles. It is a seed that will lie dormant in the winter of war that is coming, only to sprout again when the season turns. But for tonight, the work is done. The king sleeps, or tries to, while the scribes rub their cramping hands, and the wax cools into the shape of a promise that will outlive them all. The wax is cool, the seal is hard, and the scribes have rubbed the cramp from their hands. But now, in the quiet aftermath of the sealing, we must do something that few people in 1215 actually did. We must read the thing. If you were to unroll one of those fresh sheepskins, squinting in the candlelight of a medieval solar, you might be forgiven for feeling a wave of disappointment. You are looking for a thunderous declaration of human rights, a medieval version of We the People. Instead, you find yourself wading through a dense, bureaucratic thicket of feudal regulations that seem about as inspiring as a modern tax code. The Great Charter is, at first glance, an obsession with the trivial. It worries about the removal of Kai dells, fish weirs, from the River Thames. It concerns itself with the standard measures of wine, ale and corn, the London quarter. It demands that the assize of novel disseisin be held in the county court 4 times a year. It is a document written by angry landlords for angry landlords, obsessed with inheritance fees, widows' dowries, and the rights of debtors. To the modern eye, it looks like a laundry list of complaints from a neighbourhood association meeting, albeit one where the neighbours are armed knights. But wait, push aside the fish weirs and the corn measures. Look closer at the dense block of Latin text, roughly 2/3 of the way down. Here, buried in the middle of the document, nestled between a clause about the unauthorised use of the king's horses and a clause about the abatement of nuisances, lies a sentence that glows with a strange internal light. It is clause 39 in the modern numbering. In the abbreviated Latin of the scribe, it begins, nullus liber homo capiatur vel imprisonatur. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. And immediately following it, clause 40, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Pause for a moment. Let the weight of those words sink in. In a world where the king's will was often the only law that mattered, where a man could be thrown into a dungeon because the king woke up in a bad mood, or where a lawsuit could be won by bribing the judge with a ton of wine, these 2 sentences are a quiet revolution. They are the hidden seed of liberty. They do not shout, they whisper, but their whisper is destined to bring down empires. Historians and legal scholars have spent centuries arguing over what exactly the barons meant by law of the land, lex terrae, and judgment of peers, judicium parium. In 1215 they almost certainly did not mean trial by jury in the modern sense of 12 impartial citizens listening to evidence. They likely meant the ancient, rougher forms of medieval proof, trial by battle, or the solemn oath-taking of fellow knights. They were looking backward to a mythical golden age, not forward to the Supreme Court. They were trying to stop John from using his professional judges to crush them. They wanted to be judged by their fellow barons, men who understood the game of power. Furthermore, we must address the elephant in the room, or perhaps the serf in the field. The Charter speaks of the free man, liber homo. In the 13th century, this is a very exclusive club. It excludes the vast majority of the population, the villeins, the serfs, the peasants who are tied to the land. Clause 39 does not protect the man ploughing the field from his lord. It protects the lord from the king. If you were a peasant in 1215, Magna Carta offered you about as much protection as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. You were unfree, and your justice was entirely at the whim of your local master. So why does this matter? Why do we still speak of this parchment with such reverence? Because words, once written down, have a life of their own. They escape the control of their authors. The barons at Runnymede intended to build a fortress for their own privileges, but they accidentally laid the foundation for the rights of everyone. They established a principle that was radical, dangerous, and utterly transformative. That the law is not the king's tool, but the king's master. Think of the law of the land not as a set of rules, but as an atmosphere. Before this, the law was like the weather. It came from the king, sometimes sunny, sometimes stormy, always unpredictable. You just had to endure it. Clause 39 demands that the law become like the landscape, solid, mapped, predictable, something you can stand on. It asserts that there is a process that must be followed a due process before the state can touch you. John can no longer just say, "Off with his head," or "seize his castle." He has to show his work. He has to go through the motions of justice. And then there is Clause 40, "To no one will we sell." This is a direct dagger aimed at the heart of John's financial system. Remember the treasury of teeth? Remember the widows paying for the right to stay single? Clause 40 says, no more. Justice is a right, not a luxury product. You shouldn't have to be rich to be treated fairly. Of course, in practice, money has always greased the wheels of law. But to have the king admit in writing that selling justice is wrong, that is a monumental concession. It creates a standard of shame. It gives the subjects a yardstick to measure their ruler against. There is a gentle ironic humour in the fact that the most famous clauses of Magna Carta were likely not the ones the barons cared about most. They were probably far more excited about Clause 61, the security clause that gave them the power to beat up the king if he misbehaved, or the clauses about debt relief. If you had told Robert Fitzwalter that 800 years later people would ignore his carefully crafted rules about scutage, but would build statues to Clause 39, he would have looked at you with utter confusion. He was a practical man wanting to save his money. He didn't know he was writing the preamble to the American Constitution. The seed is buried in the mud of Runnymede. It is small, hard, and seemingly dormant. The charter does not immediately change the behaviour of the king. As we shall see, John ignores it almost before the ink is dry. The serfs are still serfs, the dungeons are still damp, but the idea has been planted. The concept that authority is subject to law has entered the bloodstream of English history. It acts like a slow-release virus in the body politic. Over the centuries, free man will be reinterpreted to mean every man. Law of the land will evolve into due process. Judgment of peers will become the jury system. The beauty of history lies in these unintended consequences. The barons were selfish, violent men looking out for their own interests. They were not democrats. They were not heroes. And yet, in their selfishness, they stumbled upon a universal truth. They tried to build a fence to keep the king out of their gardens, but the fence was so well built that eventually it enclosed the whole world. As night falls over the text, the scribe rolls up the parchment. The words nullus liber homo are hidden from view, curled inside the roll. They will sleep there in the dark through wars and plagues and the rise and fall of dynasties. But they will not die. They are the ghost in the machine of English law, waiting for the moment when they will be needed again. The seed is in the ground. Now it needs the rain of conflict to make it grow. The ink on the Great Charter is barely dry, and the green wax of the seal has hardly had time to cure in the English summer heat before the mechanism of its destruction is set in motion. We enter now into the phase of the great betrayal, or perhaps, if you are looking through the eyes of King John, the great escape. For weeks the meadow of Runnymede has echoed with the sounds of reconciliation, the kiss of peace, the clasped hands, the shared cups of wine. But as we have seen, John is an actor, and this has been the performance of his life. Even as he smiles at the barons, even as he jokingly chides them for their harshness, his messengers are already galloping south, riding hard for the coast. In their saddlebags they carry letters addressed to the one man in Europe who has the power to undo everything, Pope Innocent III. The peace of Runnymede is a mirage, a shimmering heat haze that is about to vanish, leaving the country exposed once again to the scorching sun of civil war. To understand the sudden, violent death of the 1215 Charter, we must shift our gaze from the damp riverside of England to the sun-baked hills of Italy. It is late August. The Pope is at Anagni his summer residence, seeking refuge from the stifling heat and malaria of Rome. Innocent the Thishti is a man of terrifying intellect and absolute certainty. He views the world as a hierarchy ordained by God, with the Pope at the apex, kings beneath him, and subjects beneath them. He has recently accepted John as his vassal. England is technically a fiefdom of the papacy. When John's envoys arrive, dusty and exhausted, and present the terms of the charter to him, Innocent does not see a document of liberty. He sees an act of rebellion. He sees a group of armed thugs, the barons, forcing his vassal, a king who has taken the Crusaders' cross, to sign away his God-given dignity. The chroniclers tell us that when Innocent had the charter read to him, his face darkened with a wrath that shook the room. Are the barons of England endeavouring to dethrone a king who has taken the cross and placed himself under the protection of the Apostolic See? He reportedly thundered. By St. Peter, we cannot pass over this insult without punishing it. The speed of his reaction is breathtaking. There are no committees, no negotiations. On August 24th, 1215, just 9 weeks after the sealing at Runnymede, Innocent issues the papal bull Etsi Carissimus. It is a masterpiece of ecclesiastical fury. In it, he declares Magna Carta to be not only shameful and demeaning, but also illegal and unjust. He annuls it completely and definitively, forbidding John to observe it and the barons to enforce it. He pronounces the charter null and void of all validity forever. Null and void forever. Let those words hang in the air. The document that we now revere as the cornerstone of democracy was, in the eyes of the highest authority on earth in 1215, a piece of garbage, a shameful stain on the fabric of royal authority. It is a delicious historical irony that the Pope, usually seen as the guardian of morality, is here acting as the enforcer of tyranny, while the bad King John is technically the obedient son of the Church. The bull travels back to England, carried by the same swift messengers, arriving in late September like a declaration of war. Back in England, the atmosphere has already curdled. The peace has been disintegrating day by day. The barons, suspicious that John is up to something, have refused to leave London. They are still wearing their armour. John, for his part, has retreated to the coast, specifically to the Isle of Wight and the ports of Kent, where he is busy looking out to sea, not for the view, but for ships. He is hiring mercenaries. He is recruiting hard men from Poitou, Flanders, and Gascony, promising them land and loot in exchange for their swords. The soft sword is sharpening his edge. When the papal bull arrives, John drops the mask. He announces that the charter is dead. He has the Pope's permission, nay, the Pope's command, to ignore it. The psychological blow to the barons is immense. They thought they had secured the law. Instead, they are now excommunicated. The Pope orders Langton to excommunicate the rebels by name, and here lies the tragedy of Stephen Langton, the Archbishop, the man who crafted the peace, who stood in the meadow and tried to build a bridge between the past and the future, is now caught between the hammer of the Pope and the anvil of the King. He refuses to publish the excommunication. He argues that the Pope has been misinformed, that the charter is just, but Innocent is not a man who tolerates dissent. He suspends Langton from his office. The adult in the room is removed. Langton leaves for Rome to plead his case, leaving England without a spiritual shepherd just as the wolves begin to howl. With Langton gone and the charter annulled, the slide into chaos is rapid and brutal. We call this the First Barons' War, but it is really a continuation of the struggle that Runnymede failed to resolve. The barons, realizing that John will never keep his word, make a fateful decision. They decide that they do not just want a new charter, they want a new king. They look across the Channel, past the recent wars, past the rivalries, to Prince Louis, the son of the French King Philip Augustus. In a move that seems shocking to modern notions of patriotism but made perfect sense in the feudal logic of 1215, the English barons invite a French prince to invade England and take the crown. They would rather have a foreign king who obeys the law than a native king who breaks it. The autumn of 1215 is a season of fear. The leaves turn brown and fall, mirroring the decay of the realm's hopes. John, now unleashed, shows the terrifying energy that has always lurked beneath his lethargy. He divides his mercenary army and strikes. He moves through the countryside like a firestorm. The chroniclers describe a campaign of fire and sword. Villages are burned, crops are destroyed, and castles are besieged. John is not fighting for territory, he is fighting for survival, and he is fighting with a viciousness that suggests he wants to punish the very land for its betrayal. Imagine the confusion of the common people. In June, they were told that the king had granted a great charter of liberties. In September, they are told the Pope says it is a sin to believe in it. In October, their barns are burning, and foreign mercenaries are speaking strange dialects in their market squares. The rule of law has lasted less than 3 months. The parchment of Runnymede is not being read in the courts. It is being trampled in the mud. One specific moment captures the darkness of this time. It is the siege of Rochester Castle, which we will explore in depth soon. But for now, picture the king standing before the mighty walls, his face twisted with a hatred that has finally found an outlet. He is no longer the Lackland who loses. He is the tyrant who destroys. He has the papal banner fluttering beside his own. He has God, or at least God's vicar, on his side. It is a terrifying combination. Historians often debate whether John ever intended to keep the charter. The consensus is a resounding no. The request to Rome was likely planned before he even arrived at Runnymede. The whole event, the tents, the seal, the kiss of peace, was a stalling tactic. There is a dark humour in this. John was so duplicitous that he managed to trick the entire nobility of England into thinking he had surrendered while he was actually reloading his weapon. It takes a special kind of cynicism to use a peace treaty as a trap. As the winter closes in, the realm is split. The barons hold London. The king holds the countryside. The church is silent, its leader suspended. The charter is a dead letter, a shameful scrap of waste paper. And yet, in the monasteries, the scribes do not destroy the copies. They hide them. They roll them up and place them in the deepest chests, under the altar cloths and the vestments. They know, with the long patience of monks, that popes die and kings die, but words, once written, have a way of haunting the living. We leave this section in the gloom of a November evening. The wind is howling around the stone corners of the castles. The king is on the march, his army a torchlight procession of destruction. The Pope's letter has turned the key in the lock, shutting the door on liberty. The lullaby has become a war drum. The Magna Carta is gone, and in its place is the sword. But as the king rides through the smoke of his own kingdom, he is unaware that he is fighting a ghost. You can burn a document, but you cannot unthink a thought, and the thought of Runnymede is already loose in the dark. The road from Dover to London is blocked by a shadow. It is the shadow of Rochester Castle, a towering fortress of Kentish ragstone that rises above the River Medway like a clenched stone fist. In the autumn of 1215, this castle becomes the stage for the most brutal, technically complex, and grotesquely memorable event of the entire Civil War. We have seen John the politician, John the coward, and John the victim. Now, prepare to meet John the destroyer. If Runnymede was a battle of words, the siege of Rochester is a battle of physics, fire, and fat. The rebels, realising that John is gathering his mercenary army in Kent, have seized Rochester in a desperate bid to stop him from reaching London. They are led by William d'Aubigny, a man of iron nerve who famously told the king he would not serve him. D'Aubigny knows that Rochester is the lock on the door to the capital. If it holds, the rebellion survives. If it falls, John's path to vengeance is clear. But when d'Aubigny arrives, he finds the castle almost empty of provisions. There is no food, no stockpile of arrows, just the cold stone walls. He frantically tries to gather supplies from the town, but he is too late. John arrives in October, not with the disorganised rabble, but with a terrifyingly professional siege train. John sets up his headquarters on the south side of the city. He is in his element here. Historians often mock John's lack of battlefield courage, but they universally acknowledge his genius at siegecraft. He is an engineer king. He understands the geometry of destruction. He surrounds the castle so tightly that, as one chronicler writes, a fly could not enter or leave without being seen. He sets up 5 great siege engines, giant trebuchets and petraria, that begin a relentless bombardment. Day and night, the sky rains stone. The crash of boulders against the keep echoes across the valley, a slow, rhythmic drumbeat of demolition. The defenders on the battlements are pummeled, unable to sleep, unable to rest, their armour dented and their nerves frayed by the constant thump-crack of the impact. But stone walls are thick, specifically 12 feet thick at the base. The bombardment chips away at the casing, but the keep stands firm. John, impatient and furious, decides to change tactics. He will not go over the wall, he will go under it. He orders his miners to begin digging. This is the dark art of medieval warfare, sap and mine. We must descend now, out of the autumn chill and into the suffocating darkness of the earth. Imagine the scene in the tunnel. It is a narrow, timber-shored passage, smelling of wet clay, sweat and fear. The miners are local men, likely pressed into service, digging with pickaxes and shovels by the light of flickering tallow candles. They are digging a void beneath the southeast corner tower of the great keep. As they dig, they prop up the ceiling with heavy wooden beams. They are literally removing the foundation of the castle, replacing the stone with wood. Above them, tons of masonry hangs suspended, supported only by these temporary timbers. It is terrifying work. One slip, one weak beam, and they are buried alive. By late November, the mine is ready. The corner of the keep is now resting entirely on a forest of wooden props. Now comes the fire. But John needs fuel. He needs something that burns hot, slow, and intense. Something that will turn the timber into ash and bring the stone crashing down. And here we find one of the most famous and bizarre writs in English history. On November 25th, John sends a letter to his justiciar, Hubert de Burgh. It is a frantic, precise order. He demands that Hubert send him, with all haste, 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating. Note the detail, least good for eating. The king is not planning a feast. He is planning an explosion. He needs the fat. He needs the grease. He effectively wants 40 barrels of bacon-fueled napalm. The pigs arrive, they are slaughtered, a squealing bloody mess in the siege camp, and their carcasses are dragged into the tunnel. They are packed in amongst the brushwood and the timber props. The miners retreat. The torch is thrown. We can only imagine the sensory experience from the outside. At first there is nothing but silence. Then a thin wisp of smoke curls up from the tunnel entrance, smelling of rendering fat and burning oak, a scent that is strangely domestic, like a kitchen fire gone wrong, but on a horrific scale. The fire rages underground, fed by the pig fat, reaching a temperature hot enough to crack stone. The wooden props, soaked in grease, turn to charcoal, and then Gravity takes over. There is a sound like the earth tearing open, a deep, grinding rumble that vibrates through the boots of the soldiers standing hundreds of yards away. The southeast tower of the keep, a structure that has stood for nearly a century, shudders. It leans. And then, with a roar that drowns out the cheers of the royal army, it collapses. A quarter of the great keep slides into the dust, dissolving into a pile of rubble. The air is filled with a choking, white cloud of pulverized lime and mortar. John must be watching with a grim, tight satisfaction. The soft sword has broken the hardest nut in England with nothing but shovels and bad bacon. His troops surge forward, scrambling over the smoking debris, swords drawn, ready to slaughter the defenders in the breach. But Rochester has a final surprise. The keep is built with a unique internal design, a cross wall that divides the interior into two separate halves. When the rebels see the tower fall, they do not surrender. They simply retreat behind the cross wall into the other half of the castle. It is a nightmare for John. He has breached the castle, only to find another castle inside it. The siege must go on. The final phase is not fought with fire, but with hunger. The defenders are trapped in the northern half of the keep. They have no food. The chroniclers tell us, with a grim fascination, that they began to eat their horses. Then they boiled the leather of their saddles and shields to make a gluey, tasteless soup. It is a scene of medieval horror. Proud knights starving in the dark, listening to the king's soldiers feasting just on the other side of the wall. The stench of the unburied dead and the lack of sanitation makes the air inside the keep poisonous. Finally, on November 30th, St. Andrew's Day, William d'Aubigny can do no more. He signals the surrender. The gates are unbarred. The defenders, gaunt, hollow-eyed and reeking of sickness, stumble out into the light. They throw their swords at the king's feet. John is apoplectic. He has spent weeks and a fortune in gold to take this place. He wants blood. He orders that every single man of the garrison be hanged. He wants to line the road to London with their swinging bodies as a warning to the barons. It is a moment where the monster threatens to overtake the king completely. But one of his mercenary captains, a man named Savaric de Montléon, steps forward. He is a pragmatic soldier. He grabs the king's arm, a brave move in itself, and speaks the cold truth of war. "My lord," he says, "the war is not yet over. If you hang these men, the barons will hang your men when they capture them. Do not start a game of slaughter that we might lose." It is the logic of the tit-for-tat. If John breaks the rules of chivalry, which dictate that a nobleman who surrenders is held for ransom, not executed, then his own mercenaries will be in danger. John listens. He is furious, his face likely flushed with that Plantagenet red rage. But he calculates. He spares the nobles. William d'Aubigny is sent to prison in chains, later to be ransomed. The knights are spared, but John needs a victim. He needs to hurt someone. He looks at the garrison and picks out the crossbowmen. These men, considered low-born mechanics of death who kill knights from a distance, are not protected by the code of chivalry. John orders one crossbowman to be hanged on a gibbet in front of the castle. It is a petty, cruel compromise, a single death to satisfy his rage. The fall of Rochester sends a shockwave through England. The barons in London, who had promised to send relief but failed to leave the safety of the city walls, are humiliated. They have let their bravest ally be starved and smoked out while they drank wine in the capital. John is now the master of the southeast. The road to London is technically open, though winter is closing in, turning the roads to mud. We leave Rochester in the silence of the aftermath. The great keep stands broken, a jagged tooth against the grey sky, the smell of burnt pig fat still lingering in the stones. John moves on, his army growing as success attracts more mercenaries. He is winning. The parchment of Runnymede seems like a distant memory, a fragile dream crushed under the weight of a falling tower. The king has proven that physics is mightier than law, but he has also proven by his near massacre of the garrison that he is a man who rules by fear alone. And fear, as any historian will tell you, is a brittle shield. It works until the moment it doesn't. As John marches north to punish the rebels in their own lands, he leaves behind a ruin, but he carries with him the seeds of his own exhaustion. The pigs have done their work, but the winter of the king's soul is just beginning. The winter of 1215 bleeds into the spring of 1216, and the map of England becomes a patchwork of mud, blood, and snow. King John, energised by his brutal success at Rochester, embarks on a campaign of terror that historians have likened to William the Conqueror's harrowing of the north. He divides his army, sending his brother, the Earl of Salisbury, to watch London, while he takes his mercenaries north to punish the rebels in their own backyards. It is a season of fire. John moves with a frenetic, terrifying speed, burning the crops, torching the villages and seizing the castles of his enemies. He is a king at war with his own kingdom, a man who seems to have decided that if he cannot be loved, he will be the nightmare that keeps his subjects awake. The chronicler Matthew Paris describes the scene with biblical horror. The king's executioners, whom he called his soldiers, went forth like devils. They tortured men to extract their hidden treasures, hanging them by their thumbs or smoking them over slow fires. It is a grim picture, painted in the colours of smoke and bruising. The Charter of Liberties feels like a cruel joke in a land where the only law is the whim of a mercenary captain. But in London, the rebel barons, huddled behind the city walls, make a decision that changes the game from a civil war to an international invasion. They realise they cannot beat John alone. They need a champion. They need a king to fight a king. And so they commit the ultimate treason. They send a formal invitation to Prince Louis of France, the eldest son of Philip Augustus, offering him the crown of England. It is a desperate gamble. They are inviting the son of their hereditary enemy to save them from their own monarch. They are effectively saying that a foreign ruler who obeys the law is better than a native ruler who is a tyrant. The scene shifts now to the French court, to a moment of high diplomatic theatre that feels like a scripted play. The Pope, Innocent III, is furious at this turn of events. He has sent a legate, Gualo, to France to forbid the invasion. Gualo stands before King Philip and Prince Louis, waving the papal bull, threatening excommunication if they dare to attack the Pope's vassal, King John. But Philip and Louis have prepared for this. They stage a magnificent argument. Philip, playing the role of the pious king, says, "I cannot stop my son, he is his own man." Louis, playing the role of the aggrieved knight, argues that John is a usurper who forfeited his crown when he murdered Arthur. He argues that John has no right to give England to the Pope, because a king cannot give away a kingdom without the consent of his barons. It is a brilliant legal fiction. They are using the language of feudal law to justify an invasion. The Pope's legate is furious, but he is outmanoeuvred. The fleet gathers. On May 21st, 1216, the English Channel is filled with the snapping of canvas and the creaking of timber. A massive French armada sets sail. Leading the fleet is a figure who seems to have stepped out of a darkly comic ballad, Eustace the monk. Eustace is a renegade, a former monk turned pirate, a man who deals in black magic and sea battles, now serving as the admiral for the French prince. The wind is favourable. The divine wind that usually protects England blows the wrong way. On the cliffs of Kent, near the town of Sandwich, King John is waiting. He has a massive army, perhaps bigger than the French force. He has the home advantage. He has the ships to intercept them. This should be the moment where John redeems Bouvines, This should be the moment he drives the invaders back into the sea. He paces the beach, his cloak whipping in the wind, leaning on his staff. He watches the white sails crest the horizon, hundreds of them, looking like a flock of gulls descending on a feast. And then the old sickness returns. The soft sword wavers. He looks at his own army, largely made up of foreign mercenaries, men from Flanders and Poitou. He wonders, will they fight against the son of the French king, or will they switch sides the moment the battle is joined? Paranoia, cold and paralysing, grips him. Instead of ordering the attack, John orders the retreat. He turns his back on the sea and runs. He abandons the coast, leaving the door to England wide open. It is a collapse of nerve that seals his fate. The French land unopposed. Prince Louis steps onto English soil, not as an invader fighting his way up the beach, but as a guest walking into an open house. The local people, tired of John's tyranny, actually cheer him. Louis marches to London. His progress is a triumph. On June 2nd, he enters the capital. The streets are lined with cheering crowds. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral, silent during the interdict, are ringing again, or at least the secular bells are pealing in welcome. In the cathedral, under the soaring stone arches, a surreal ceremony takes place. The barons of England, the very men who surely grew up hating the French, kneel before Louis and do homage to him. They swear fealty to the heir of France. For a brief, strange summer, England has two kings. There is John, skulking in the West Country, and there is Louis, holding court in Westminster. Historians often gloss over this, calling Louis the Pretender, but for all practical purposes he was King Louis the Cern of England for a year. He controlled the capital, the treasury, and the loyalty of the majority of the barons. The summer of 1216 is a disaster for John. His kingdom dissolves like sugar in hot tea. One by one, the great castles surrender to Louis. The Earl of Salisbury, John's own brother, defects to the French side. The Earl of Warren, a staunch loyalist, switches sides. They see the writing on the wall. The momentum is entirely with the young, charismatic French prince who promises to honour the laws and restore the ancient customs. And John is reduced to a fugitive, moving rapidly from castle to castle in the west, carrying his treasury with him in a train of wagons, afraid to stay in one place for more than a few nights. Yet there is a strange tension in the air. The English barons are happy to use Louis to get rid of John, but they are beginning to notice something unsettling. Louis brings his own men. He gives English castles to French knights. He appoints French sheriffs. The liberator is starting to look a lot like a conqueror. A whisper begins to circulate. If we trade a tyrannical English king for a tyrannical French king, what have we gained? The xenophobia that runs deep in the English soil begins to stir. But for now, they are committed. They have ridden the tiger, and they dare not dismount. In the midst of this collapse, tragedy strikes the papacy. Innocent III, the Titan who tried to micromanage Europe, dies in Perugia in July. John loses his most powerful protector. The news reaches England slowly, adding to the sense of isolation. John is now truly alone. He has no pope, no capital, and half his barons are bowing to a Frenchman. But John, cornered and desperate, fights on. He is like a badger in a hole, snapping at the dogs. He raids the lands of the rebels. He besieges the castles that have turned against him. There is a frantic energy to his movements. He is consuming massive amounts of cider and peaches, his favourite comfort foods, which play havoc with his digestion, a detail the chroniclers note with gleeful specificity. He is a man physically and mentally unravelling. As September turns to October, the endgame approaches. The country is exhausted, the fields are trampled. The smoke of burning villages hangs low in the autumn mist. The the story has become a tragedy of errors. The barons invited a lion to catch a wolf, and now they are worried the lion will eat them too. John is moving east again, towards Lincoln and Lynn, trying to rally his last remaining supporters. He is heading towards the Wash, a treacherous estuary of tidal mudflats and shifting sands. He is heading towards a disaster that will become the final legend of his reign. We leave this section with the image of Prince Louis, sitting on the throne in Westminster Hall, speaking French to his captains, planning the final conquest of the island. He looks every inch the king. The conquest seems complete. The Plantagenet dynasty is hanging by a thread. But history turns on small things. A microbe in a cup of water, a sudden tide on a muddy beach, the beating of a heart that is growing tired. The French prince is winning the war, but he has not yet defeated the weather, the geography, or the stubborn, messy complexity of English loyalty. The stage is set for the final act, where the crown will be lost in the water and the king will be lost to the night. The landscape of the English fens in October is a study in melancholy. It is a world where the earth and the sky seem to dissolve into one another, a flat grey expanse of marshland, reed beds, and sluggish water that reflects the leaden clouds above. We are in the final days of King John's life, and the setting could not be more fitting for the dissolution of a tragedy. The year is 1216, and the king is in King's Lynn, a town that has remained fiercely loyal to him while the rest of the country bows to the French prince. John is welcomed here, feasted, and given gifts, but his eyes are yellow with fatigue, and his temper is brittle as spun sugar. He is a man running out of land, running out of friends, and running out of time. On the morning of October 12th, John makes a decision that will seal his legend in the silt of history. He needs to move his army and his household north into Lincolnshire to secure the roads. To go the long way around the great estuary known as the Wash would take days of marching over rough roads. To cut across the estuary at low tide, over the exposed sands, would take only hours. It is a gamble, the kind of shortcut a desperate man takes. John, perhaps feeling the first cramps of the illness that will kill him, decides to split his force. He, with a small mounted escort, will take the longer, safer route around the edge of the bay. But his baggage train, that lumbering serpentine beast of heavy wagons, pack horses and servants, is ordered to cross the sands. We must pause to appreciate what this baggage train actually is. It is not just a collection of tents and cooking pots. It is the mobile heart of the Angevin monarchy. In these wagons are the rolls of the chancery, the legal memory of the kingdom. There are the portable altars and the holy relics, bones of saints encased in gold, that John prays to with his superstitious fervour. There are the heavy chests filled with the coin he has wrung from the church and the barons. And most precious of all, there are the crown jewels, the great gold crown of his grandmother, the Empress Matilda, the sword of Tristram, the ceremonial robes of silk and samite, the accumulation of a dynasty's greed and glory. It is a travelling museum of power. The train sets out across the estuary. At low tide, the Wash looks deceptively benign, a vast, glistening plain of wet sand stretching to the horizon, dotted with shallow pools. The guide, a local man who supposedly knows the safe paths, leads the way. The wagons creak and groan, their iron-rimmed wheels cutting deep ruts into the sand. The drivers shout, whipping the oxen. They are racing the moon. They have a window of perhaps 3 or 4 hours before the sea returns. For a while, it seems to work. They are halfway across, a dark line of ants on a silver plate. But the Wash is a treacherous beast. It is famous for its quicksands and its hidden creeks, channels of soft, sucking mud that can swallow a horse to its belly in seconds. And then there is the tide, In this part of England, the tide does not creep in, it rushes. The incoming water fights against the outflow of the rivers, creating a phenomenon known as a bore, a wall of water that can move faster than a galloping horse. The disaster begins not with a wave, but with a sound, a low distant roar, like thunder underground. The guides stop. They look at the horizon. The grey line of the sea is thickening, moving closer with terrifying speed. Panic ripples through the column. The drivers try to turn the wagons, but the wheels are sunk deep in the soft sand. The oxen panic, bellowing and thrashing in the mud. The lead wagon, heavy with gold, hits a patch of quicksand and sinks to its axles. It blocks the path. Then the water hits. It is cold, brown, and relentless. It swirls around the horses' legs, rising to their knees, their chests. The sand, which was solid a moment ago, turns to soup. The wagons begin to float, then tip over. The chests slide off into the swirling current. Men scream, not in battle, but in the terrifying helplessness of drowning in 3 feet of water. The sea takes everything. It takes the silver chalices. It takes the silk robes. It takes the crown of England. The regalia, the physical symbols of the king's right to rule, are washed away into the murky depths of the well stream. Historians still argue fiercely about the exact location of this disaster, and indeed, whether it was quite as total as the chroniclers claim. Some suggest John lost only part of his train. Others suggest it was a convenient story to cover up theft by his own servants. But the psychological truth is undeniable. When John, watching from the safety of the far bank or receiving the news from a dripping survivor, realizes what has happened, he is broken. It is the ultimate cosmic irony. The king who spent his entire life grasping for wealth, who pulled the teeth of Jews and taxed the widows to fill his chests, watches it all vanish into the indifferent mud. He is left standing on the shore, a king without a crown, a ruler with nothing to rule but the wind. The shock seems to accelerate his illness. By the time he reaches the Cistercian abbey at Swineshead that night, he is violently ill. The chroniclers, always eager to find a moral cause for a physical ailment, attribute it to a gluttonous binge. They say he gorged himself on peaches and drank copious amounts of new cider, a lethal combination for a man with a delicate stomach and a high fever. There is a darker myth, whispered in the cloisters later, that a monk, hearing John threaten to raise the price of bread until a loaf cost a shilling, poisoned the king's plums and then ate one himself to prove they were safe, sacrificing his life to save the realm. It is a dramatic story, fitting for a villain, but the medical reality is likely less poetic. Dysentery, the bloody flux. It is a disease of unwashed hands, dirty water, and exhaustion, a soldier's death, stripping away all dignity. John is in agony, but he refuses to stop. He orders his men to carry him forward. He is put on a litter, a bed suspended between 2 horses. But the jolting of the road causes him such pain that he screams out. They have to stop and build a smoother litter. He is carried to Sleaford Castle, then slowly, painfully, towards Newark. The journey is a funeral procession for a living man. The king is sweating, delirious, his body failing him. As he lies in the litter, watching the grey sky slide by, does he think of Runnymede? Does he think of the wax seal melting? Does he think of Arthur in the river, or the starving men of Rochester? Or does he simply think of the peaches? The mind of a dying king is a private kingdom, but the world outside is moving on. The news of his illness spreads faster than his litter. The barons pause. Prince Louis pauses. They are waiting. The death of a tyrant changes the math of the war instantly. They arrive at Newark Castle on October 16th. The fortress stands high above the River Trent, a strong grey sentinel. John is carried up the winding stairs to the royal apartments. The wind howls around the towers. The soft sword is laid in a bed he will never leave. He summons his few remaining loyalists. There is William Marshall, the old oak of a man, his face lined with grief and worry. There is the papal legate. John knows it is the end. He dictates his will. It is a surprisingly humble document for such an arrogant man. He does not command. He pleads. He asks for his body to be buried not in the royal mausoleum at Fontevraud with his father and brother, but in Worcester Cathedral, near the shrine of St. Wulfstan. He wants to be buried between two saints, Wulfstan and Oswald, perhaps hoping their holiness will shield his sinful soul from the coming wrath. He appoints a council of 13 men to help his son, Henry. Henry is only 9 years old. John is leaving a child to clean up a civil war. It is his final legacy, a broken kingdom, a lost treasury, and a boy king surrounded by wolves. Outside the castle walls, the storm that has battered England for days continues to rage. The chroniclers say a great wind blew up on the night of the 18th, shaking the very foundations of Newark. It was as if the devil was coming to collect his due. Inside the chamber, the candlelight flickers. The king's breathing becomes shallow. The peaches, the cider, the dysentery, the exhaustion, the rage, they have all done their work. The struggle is over. We leave John here. In the dim light of the death chamber, the sound of the wind masking the sound of his final breaths. The treasure is lost in the mud of the wash, buried under feet of silt, waiting for archaeologists who will never find it. The crown is gone. But in the darkness, a strange thing is happening. As the king fades, the hatred of him begins to fade too, replaced by the cold calculation of politics. John dead is more useful than John alive. The obstacle to peace is being removed. The man who signed the charter is dying, but the charter itself, which everyone thought was dead, is about to stir in the silence. The king is dead. Long live the law. The storm that howled around the deathbed of King John has passed, leaving behind a silence that feels fragile and cold, like the air after a heavy snowfall. We must now travel swiftly from the gloom of Newark to the Abbey Church of Gloucester, where a hurried, desperate ceremony is taking place. It is October 28th, 1216. Just 9 days after John's death, the country is in ruins. The capital is occupied by a French prince. The treasury is lost in the mud. And the hope of the Plantagenet dynasty rests on the shoulders of a boy who is small for his age, with a drooping eyelid and a shy, uncertain smile. Henry III is 9 years old. Close your eyes and picture him standing in the draughty nave of the church, surrounded by a handful of loyal barons and bishops. He is dressed in robes that have been hastily cut down to fit his small frame. He looks lost, a child dressed up for a play that has suddenly become terrifyingly real. There is no Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him. Langton is still in Rome. There is no crown. The great regalia is rusting at the bottom of the wash. And so, in a detail that touches the heart with its vulnerability, the Queen Mother, Isabella of Angoulême, takes a simple golden torque, a necklace, from her own throat and offers it to the bishop. It is placed on the boy's head. It is too big, perhaps slipping down over his ears, a poignant symbol of the burden he has inherited. As the holy oil is anointed on his forehead, Henry bursts into tears. He is terrified. He has seen his father raging and dying. He knows the wolves are at the door. The few barons present swear their oaths of homage, their gauntleted hands enclosing the small soft hands of the boy. It is a moment of extreme fragility. By all the laws of probability, this reign should end in weeks. The French Prince Louis holds the power, the money, and the momentum. The Plantagenets are finished. But standing behind the weeping boy is a figure who casts a shadow long enough to save a kingdom. It is William Marshal, the Earl of Pembroke. If you look closely at the history of the Middle Ages, you will find William Marshal standing quietly in the background of almost every major event, holding the world together. He is nearly 70 years old, an ancient age for a knight who has spent his life battered in tournaments and battles. He is the greatest knight, a man who rose from being a penniless younger son to the regent of England through sheer competence and loyalty. He served Henry II, he served Richard, he served John, and now, with a weariness we can almost feel in our own bones, he agrees to serve the boy. If all the world deserts the young king, Marshal famously says, I will carry him on my shoulders, step by step, from island to island and land to land, even if I have to beg for my bread. Marshal knows that they cannot win this war with swords alone. They are outnumbered. To save the throne, he must perform a piece of political alchemy. He must steal the rebels' cause. He realizes that the barons are fighting not against the monarchy itself, but against the tyranny of John. Now that John is dead, the reason for the war is buried in the crypt at Worcester. Marshal decides to do the unthinkable. He decides to give the rebels exactly what they wanted. On November 12th, 1216, at Bristol, William Marshal and the papal legate, Gualo, issue a document in the name of the young king. It is the Magna Carta. But it is not the same document that was sealed at Runnymede. It has been pruned, edited, and reshaped. Marshal, with the wisdom of a man who knows how power actually works, removes the radical bits. He cuts out Clause 61, the security clause that created the committee of 25 barons with the power to overrule the king. He argues, quite rightly, that a king cannot rule if he has a committee constantly threatening to steal his castles. He removes the specific demands about Jewish debts and the most restrictive tax clauses. But what remains is still revolutionary. The core principles, the freedom of the church, the protection against arbitrary imprisonment, the idea that the king is subject to the law, are kept intact. And here is the genius of the move. In 1215, the charter was a treaty forced upon a king by rebels. In 1216, it is a gift from the king to his people. It changes from a symbol of humiliation into a manifesto of good government. It is a peace offering. Marshal is effectively saying to the rebel barons, look, the tyrant is dead, his son is innocent, and we, the regents, promise to rule by the very laws you fought for. So why are you bowing to a French prince? It is a masterstroke. The psychological tide begins to turn. The reissue of 1216 is the moment Magna Carta stops being a failure and starts being a constitution. It is stamped with the seal of William Marshal because the boy king does not yet have a seal of his own. The wax bears the image of the old knight, a visual guarantee that the promise is backed by a man of honour. The winter passes and the war drags on, but the energy has shifted. The English barons who had defected to Louis begin to feel uncomfortable. They look at the 9-year-old Henry, an anointed king, an English boy, and then they look at Louis, who is surrounding himself with French counts. The ancient pull of feudal loyalty, combined with the new promise of the Charter, creates a magnetic field that slowly pulls them back. A chronicler notes that the hearts of men were softened towards the child. It is hard to feel righteous about fighting a weeping 9-year-old. The climax of this war of the Charter comes in May 1217 at the Battle of Lincoln. It is one of the strangest battles in English history, often called the Fair of Lincoln, because it was so chaotic and looting heavy that it resembled a country fair. William Marshal, now 70 years old, leads the charge personally. Imagine the scene. The old lion, arthritic but adrenaline-fueled, strapped into his armour for one last ride. He forgets to put on his helmet in his excitement and has to be reminded by a squire. He leads the charge up the steep cobbled streets of Lincoln, smashing into the French and rebel forces. It is a rout. The French commander is killed, stabbed through the eye slit of his helmet, and the rebel barons are captured by the dozen. But Marshall does not execute them. He does not hang them as John would have done. He ransoms them, he forgives them, and he welcomes them back. He uses the victory to unify, not to punish. The Charter has provided the framework for this reconciliation. It allows the rebels to return to the fold with their dignity intact. They can say, "We fought for the Charter and we won the Charter," even as they kneel to the king. By September 1217, the war is over. The Treaty of Lambeth is signed. Prince Louis, paid a hefty bribe to cover his travel expenses, packs his bags and sails back to France, never to be King of England. And in the aftermath of the peace, the Charter is reissued yet again. This version, the 1217 Charter, is the one that truly cements the text into English law. It is now a permanent part of the landscape. Scholars often point out a fascinating detail about the 1217 reissue. It was actually two documents. The main charter dealt with the laws of the land, but the clauses dealing with the royal forests were taken out and put into a separate, smaller parchment. The main document was so big it was called Magna Carta, the Great Charter, to distinguish it from the smaller Charter of the Forest. This is the first time the name Magna Carta is officially used. Before this, it was just the Charter of Liberties. So, the name we know it by today was actually a nickname born of bureaucracy, a way for a clerk to tell which role was which. As we watch the young King Henry grow, the Charter grows with him. It is no longer a shameful document. It is read in the county courts. It is proclaimed by the sheriffs. It hangs in the cathedrals. The boy king, innocent of his father's crimes, becomes the vessel for the law. He is not a strong king. Henry will grow up to be a pious, artistic, somewhat ineffective ruler, a builder of Westminster Abbey rather than an empire, but his weakness is the Charter's strength. Because he is a minor, the country is ruled by a council, and the council rules by the Charter. For 10 years, England is effectively a constitutional monarchy, governed by a piece of parchment and the consensus of the barons. The seed, planted in the mud of Runnymede, has survived the frost. It has been watered by the tears of a boy and the wisdom of an old man. It has changed from a sword aimed at the king's heart into a shield that protects the king's throne. As the section closes, picture William Marshall, his work finally done, retiring to his manor at Caversham to die. He has saved the kingdom, and he has saved the Charter. He lies on his deathbed, a man who has outlived all the giants of his age, and perhaps he smiles, knowing that the little strip of sheepskin with his seal on it will outlast them all. The boy king sits on his throne, his feet now reaching the floor. Holding a scepter he is still learning to wield, while in the chest beside him the Great Charter sleeps, dreaming of the future. We step now from the echoing stone halls of the courts into the dappled, breathing silence of the woods. While Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was busy securing the rights of barons to inherit castles and hold swift trials, there was a second, quieter revolution taking place amongst the ancient oaks and beeches of England. It is a story often eclipsed by its big brother, but to the 90% of the population who lived, worked, and died on the land, this document was the true deliverer. We speak of the Carta de Foresta, the Charter of the Forest, issued alongside the Great Charter in 1217. If Magna Carta was the mind of the Constitution, the Forest Charter was its heartbeat. pumping life back into the commons and returning the natural world to the people who depended on it for their very survival. To understand why this was such a profound moment, we must first feel the suffocation that preceded it. For over a century, since the days of William the Conqueror, the royal forest had been spreading like a green plague. As we touched upon earlier, the forest was not a geographical description of trees. It was a legal designation, a zone of absolute royal power where the ordinary laws of England did not apply. By the time of King John, nearly a third of England was forest. It included not just woods, but heathland, villages, and even entire towns. Inside this zone, nature was a monopoly. The deer, the boar, the hare, and the timber belonged to the king. To take a fallen branch for firewood was a crime. To kill a deer to feed a starving family was a capital offence, punishable by blinding or death. The forest law was the hated symbol of Norman tyranny, a declaration that the king owned the earth itself. But in 1217, under the regency of William Marshal, the tide turned. The new Charter of the Forest was issued to correct the evil customs of the past. It began with a promise that felt like a deep inhalation of fresh air. It called for disafforestation. This meant that all the lands that Kings Henry II, Richard, and John had greedily claimed for the forest were to be returned to the common law. Imagine the scene that followed, a ritual known as the perambulation. Knights and local juries, 12 lawful men of the county, would physically walk the boundaries of the forest. They were mapmakers of liberty. As they walked, marking a particular oak tree, a stream, or a stone marker as the new limit, they were literally shrinking the king's power with every step. Where they walked, the king's law ended and the people's rights began. The woods that had been a place of fear, patrolled by the king's foresters, who were often little more than armed thugs, suddenly became a place of opportunity again. The psychological shift must have been dizzying. The king's wood became once more the community's wood. The clauses of the Charter of the Forest are a beautiful catalogue of medieval rural life, a list of rights that smell of earth, rain, and livestock. It restored the right of pannage, the right to drive pigs into the woods in autumn to fatten them on acorns and beech mast. This sounds trivial to modern ears, but in the 13th century it was the difference between surviving the winter and starving. A peasant's pig was his bank account, his winter protein. The charter secured the right of estover, gathering wood for fuel and repairs. It allowed for the digging of turf and the collection of honey. It was a recognition that the forest was not just a hunting ground for the rich, but a larder for the poor. Scholarly debate often centres on whether this was an early form of environmental protection or simply a resource management treaty. But for the peasant, watching his pigs root in the leaves, it was freedom. Perhaps the most humane clause of the Forest Charter was the one that dealt with the king's dogs. Under the old laws, mastiffs kept by farmers in the forest had to be lawed, a brutal practice where 3 claws of the dog's forefoot were cut off to prevent them from chasing the king's deer. The charter limited this cruelty, regulating when and how it could be done, and stopping the foresters from using it as an excuse to extort money. It also abolished the death penalty for poaching. "No one shall henceforth lose life or limb for our venison," the charter declared. Instead, the punishment was a heavy fine or imprisonment for a year and a day. If the poacher could not pay, he was exiled from the realm. It was still harsh, but it was no longer a blood sport. The king was effectively saying that a deer's life was no longer worth a man's eyes. There is a wonderful, soft irony in the fact that this document, which gave so much to the common man, was likely driven by the barons' desire to maximise their own profits. The barons wanted the forest boundaries rolled back so they could exploit the timber and land for themselves. They were not early socialists, they were capitalists, tired of the king's monopoly. Yet, in checking the king, they accidentally created the concept of the commons, the idea that there are resources which belong to everyone and no one, spaces that are shared. The Charter of the Forest established a rhythm of life that would endure for centuries. It created the verderers, officials elected by the county to protect the vert, the green vegetation, and the venison, the game. These courts allowed the local people to have a say in the management of the woods. It was a localised democracy of the trees. The atmosphere of the Forest Charter is less dramatic than Runnymede, but it is more enduring. Close your eyes and imagine the sensory shift. The tension of the castle with its whispers and stone walls gives way to the open air. The sound is not the scratching of a quill, but the thwack of an axe chopping firewood, a sound that is no longer a crime. It is the smell of wood smoke rising from a cottage chimney, smoke that is legal because the wood was gathered by right, not by theft. It is the taste of wild honey, gathered from a hollow tree without fear of the warden. The forest, once a dark place of royal secrets, becomes a place of light and sustenance. Historians have noted that while Magna Carta was reissued and confirmed many times, the Charter of the Forest was often the one the people clamoured for most. In the centuries of unrest that followed, when peasants rose up to demand their rights, they didn't shout for due process or jury trials. They shouted for the Forest Charter. They wanted their wood, their pigs, and their open spaces. It spoke to a primal need for connection with the land. It touched on a truth that we are perhaps rediscovering today, that access to nature is a fundamental human right, not a privilege of the crown. As the years of Henry III's reign lengthen, the Charter of the Forest settles into the soil of England. The great perambulations define the landscape. The stone markers are set. The metes and bounds are recorded. The king still hunts, and the deer are still protected, but the absolute terror is gone. The forest becomes a shared space, a patchwork of rights and responsibilities. The greenwood of Robin Hood legends, which began to circulate around this time, shifts from a place of resistance to a place of regulated liberty. The outlaw is replaced by the freeholder. We leave this section in the twilight of an autumn evening under the canopy of the New Forest. The acorns are falling with soft thuds onto the moss. A herd of pigs, snorting and grunting, moves through the undergrowth, watched by a swineherd who leans on his staff, unafraid. He is not a baron, he is not a bishop. He cannot read the Latin on the parchment sealed by William Marshall, but he knows that the woods have opened up. He knows that the king's fence has been moved back, and as he watches the mist rise from the stream, he feels a quiet ownership of the earth beneath his boots. The Great Charter gave him the law. The Forest Charter gave him his life. The two documents, bound together, have created a space where a man can be free, both in the court and in the wild. The sun sets through the branches, casting long shadows that look like the bars of a prison dissolving into the night. The woods are open. We have walked the muddy road from the Angevin to the Boy King, through fire, flood, and the quiet of the forest, and now we arrive at the final station of our journey, the long, resonant afterlife of the Great Charter. The story of Magna Carta does not end with the death of the men who wrote it. In fact, its true life only begins once the ink has faded to brown and the wax has grown brittle with age. We are now watching the transformation of a political truce into a sacred relic, a piece of parchment that transcends its own time to become the eternal echo of liberty. It is a survival story against the odds, for history is usually unkind to paper. Of the dozens of copies that galloped out of Runnymede in June 12 or 15, only 4 survive today. 2 are in the British Library, 1 is in Lincoln Cathedral, and 1 is in Salisbury Cathedral. They are fragile things, Written on the skin of sheep that grazed in English fields 800 years ago. One of the London copies was nearly destroyed in a fire in 1731. It is now a shriveled, illegible lump of fused parchment, a testament to how close we came to losing the physical proof of the promise. But the words had already escaped the fire. For a long time in the late Middle Ages and the Tudor era, Magna Carta slept. It was confirmed by kings, as a matter of routine, recited at the opening of Parliament like a dull prayer, but its revolutionary fire seemed to have gone out. When William Shakespeare wrote his play King John in the 1590s, he did not mention Magna Carta once. Think of that. The greatest storyteller in the English language told the story of the bad king and completely left out the most famous event of his reign. To the Tudors, with their belief in the absolute power and majesty of the monarch, the idea of barons dictating terms to a king was uncomfortable, perhaps even dangerous. The charter was viewed as an embarrassing relic of a chaotic past, a dusty statute regarding fish weirs and feudal reliefs. But ideas, like seeds, can lie dormant for centuries in the dry soil of the law books, waiting for the right season to germinate. That season arrived in the 17th century. The Stuart kings, James I and Charles I, began to preach the divine right of kings, the belief that the monarch is accountable only to God and that Parliament exists only by his grace. Against this absolutism rose the lawyers, led by Sir Edward Coke. Coke was a man who loved the law with a fierce, almost religious passion. He dug into the archives. He blew the dust off the medieval rolls, and he rediscovered Magna Carta. He took Clause 39, the clause about the law of the land, and he weaponized it. He told the Parliament that Magna Carta was not just a feudal contract, it was the ancient constitution of England. He argued that it proved the king was under the law, not above it. He famously declared, "Magna Carta is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign." Coke was reinventing history to suit his needs, reading modern rights into medieval texts, but it worked. Magna Carta became the battle cry of the English Civil War. It was the shield used by the parliamentarians against the crown. When Charles III was put on trial, the ghost of Runnymede was standing in the courtroom. The charter had shifted from a document about baronial privilege to a document about national liberty. It crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the mental luggage of the Puritans and the colonists. When the American revolutionaries began to argue against George III, they did not use new arguments. They used the old ones. They claimed the rights of Englishmen. When they wrote the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law," they were translating Clause 39 directly. The law of the land had become due process, but the lineage was unbroken. The echo of the Thames Valley was heard in Philadelphia. In the 20th century, the Charter became a global symbol. When Eleanor Roosevelt helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, she called it a Magna Carta for all mankind. It travelled to India, to Canada, to Australia. It stands today as a symbol of the rule of law. The simple, radical, beautiful idea that the government cannot just do whatever it wants. It must follow the rules. It must respect the individual. It must answer to something higher than its own will. Yet, we must end with a note of gentle realism. If you visit Runnymede today, you will not find a castle or a cathedral. It is still just a meadow, green and quiet, bisected by a busy road and watched over by the gentle hills. There is a memorial there, built not by the English, but by the American Bar Association, a rotunda of stone that honours freedom under law. The River Thames still flows past, indifferent to the monuments. The anchor wicker yew, the tree that may have witnessed the sealing, is still there, gnarled and ancient, surely one of the oldest living things in England. The true legacy of Magna Carta is not in the ink or the wax. Most of its clauses have been repealed. We no longer care about cuddles in the Thames or the debts of the Jews to the Crown. As a legal statute, it is largely dead. But as a myth, as a touchstone, as a bedtime story for democracy, it is immortal. It reminds us that power is seductive and needs to be restrained. It reminds us that freedom is not a gift from above, but something that must be negotiated, struggled for, and written down over and over again. It reminds us of the human struggle at the heart of history, the clash between the Johns, who want to take, and the Marshalls, who want to build. The story of King John and Magna Carta is, in the end, a story about the victory of the invisible over the visible. The castles of John have crumbled. The silver pennies have been lost in the mud. The great families of the barons have died out, but the words remain. Nullus liber homo, no free man. The idea is stronger than the stone. It is a whisper that became a shout that became a law, and a law that became a legend. It is the golden thread that runs through the tapestry of our lives, connecting us to those muddy, angry, hopeful men in a field in 1215. They did not know they were writing for us. They were writing for themselves. But in seeking to secure their own small corner of the world, they lit a candle that has never gone out. The wind blows, the river runs, and the charter waits, ready to be read whenever the shadow of tyranny falls across the page. And now, the long scroll of history rolls itself up, the parchment dry and crinkling softly in the quiet of the night. The angry voices of the barons have faded into the rustle of the leaves. The scratching of the scribe's quill has stopped. The heavy wax seal is cool to the touch. The fires of the siege of Rochester have burned down to embers, glowing softly in the dark before turning to ash. The waters of the Wash have receded, leaving only the smooth, silent sand under the moonlight. The king sleeps in his tomb, and the boy king sleeps in his bed, safe under the watch of the old night. The struggle is over. The millstone of the law has stopped its grinding. There is only the gentle flow of the River Thames, moving endlessly towards the sea, carrying the memories of the past away into the mist. You are part of this long, unbroken chain of time, safe in the present, protected by the echoes of the past. Let the weight of the centuries lift from your shoulders. The world is ordered, the laws are written, and the night is yours. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm velvet cloak. Close your eyes. Drift away from the meadow, away from the court, into the deep, dreamless peace of your own rest, sweet dreams.